Don't send me away, I'll tell you a secret. Annie pressed one hand against the concrete and slowly rose to her feet. The noisy parking lot fell silent. The pen in Charles Whitmore's hand stopped just above the final page of the acquisition agreement. He was seated at a temporary table near Red Valley's main gate, where his lawyers and assistants had prepared the transfer documents. Charles looked up at the young woman standing several steps away. Dust covered one knee of Annie's work pants. Her employee badge hung crooked against her shirt. She was still trembling after the fall, but she did not cry or look back at the security guard who had pushed her out of line. "What secret?" Charles asked. Annie struggled to catch her breath. She did not ask to keep her job. She did not explain her family situation or appeal to his sympathy. Instead, she looked toward Richard Vale, the operations director standing beside Charles. "There are things being grown on this farm that don't appear on any of the maps you were given." Richard's face tightened for a brief moment. Then he laughed loudly enough for the nearby workers holding cardboard boxes to hear. "This is pathetic," Richard said. "She's only a temporary worker who can't accept being fired, so she's inventing stories to get attention." Annie turned back to Charles. "You're scheduled to sign a technology transfer agreement with Agrinova this afternoon. If you sign before inspecting the area beneath Greenhouse 4, the company you just bought could lose its most valuable assets before tomorrow morning." Charles slowly lowered the pen, but he did not place it on the table. Red Valley Agricultural Systems stretched across thousands of acres in Iowa. The complex included research greenhouses, seed processing buildings, cold storage facilities, and a data center that controlled most of the automated systems. Charles had acquired the corporation after months of negotiations. His first order had been to replace the entire existing workforce with a new team of his own choosing. The decision had taken less than 10 minutes. Now the consequences stood outside the gate, holding cardboard boxes filled with personal belongings. Charles looked at the badge on Annie's shirt. "You've worked here for 4 months." "Yes, sir." "What exactly was your job?" "Cleaning greenhouse equipment, checking irrigation lines for leaks, and assisting the maintenance crew when needed." "No seed research?" "No." "No access to confidential technical records?" "No." Charles studied her for a long moment. "So you're asking me to believe that a temporary employee discovered something my engineers, auditors, and due diligence specialists all missed?" Annie did not avoid the question. "I don't know whether your people missed it or whether no one ever took them to the right place." Richard immediately stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore, there is no reason to continue this. She has no scientific training, no access to important data, and nowhere near enough experience to understand what she thinks she saw." "I never said I saw confidential data," Annie replied. "But you know the signing schedule. I heard 2 technicians talking beneath the East Irrigation Station." Richard gave a dry laugh. "Beneath the irrigation station? Now she's inventing secret tunnels." "There is an eastern tunnel. It used to be an old drainage channel," Richard said. "It was sealed years ago." Annie looked directly at him. "Then why have your technicians used it after midnight 3 times this week?" Murmurs spread among the workers. Richard spun toward them. "Keep moving. No one is permitted to remain here." A security officer approached Annie, preparing to remove her from the area. Charles raised one hand. "Let her speak." The guard stopped. Richard leaned toward Charles and lowered his voice. "Sir, she is an 18-year-old dropout who has only worked here for a few months. Her father used to be part of the maintenance crew. After he died, her family blamed Red Valley for every hardship they faced." Annie remained still, but her eyes never left Richard. Samuel Reed, the longtime maintenance supervisor, stepped out from the group of workers. "That's enough, Vale." 2 security officers immediately blocked him. Richard did not look at Samuel. "She needs money," he continued. "That's all this is. If we keep listening, she'll soon demand compensation, a new position, or a chance to appear in front of the media." Charles looked at Annie. He still did not believe her. Large acquisition. Annie had no clear evidence to place in front of him. She had only her account, an old tunnel, and a certainty in her eyes that he could not explain. "What do you want?" Charles asked. Annie looked momentarily startled. "Sir? Money? Your job back? Or an agreement in exchange for your silence?" Richard smiled faintly, as though the question had finally returned the situation to familiar ground. Annie looked at Charles. "If I wanted money, I would have started by telling you how poor I am." Richard's smile faded. "I don't need you to give me my job back," Annie continued. "I only need you not to sign until you've checked for yourself." Charles placed the pen on the table. You understand that an accusation like this could cause dozens of people to be investigated? I understand. And if you're wrong, you won't merely lose your job. You could be held responsible for disrupting a major transaction. I understand. Then why are you still standing here? Annie looked toward Greenhouse 4, visible beyond the administrative buildings. Because if I stay silent, there may be nothing left to save by tomorrow morning. Richard stepped closer. Mr. Whitmore. She is manipulating the situation. There is no evidence that any hidden storage facility exists. Annie turned toward him. If you haven't done anything wrong, why do you need me gone so quickly? Richard opened his mouth, but Annie continued before he could answer. I never named you. I only said something was being hidden. You were the first person who felt the need to explain that you had nothing to do with it. Several workers exchanged quiet looks. Charles noticed it as well. However, he did not treat Richard's reaction as evidence. Anger could come from pressure, insult, or simply fear that the transaction might be delayed. He looked back at Annie. You're drawing conclusions from his reaction. Maybe, Annie replied. That's why I'm asking you to investigate instead of asking you to believe me. Her answer left Charles silent for several seconds. Richard glanced at his watch. The Agranova representatives are already on their way. A delay now could cost us millions. Signing the wrong agreement could cost us more, Charles said. Richard inhaled slowly and regained control of his voice. Red Valley has undergone complete due diligence. Every greenhouse, storage facility, patent, and seed sample is listed in the digital inventory. A temporary worker cannot point at a wall and claim that an entire research facility exists behind it. Annie nodded toward the administrative building, then opened the map for Greenhouse 4. Charles looked at Daniel Price, his private security director. Show me. Daniel opened his tablet, accessed the facility plans, and located Greenhouse 4. He enlarged the eastern foundation and turned the screen toward Charles. The map showed an irrigation station, a pump room, and a solid wall running along the foundation. Annie pointed to that section. There's an empty space behind that wall. Richard shook his head. She cannot know that. My father maintained the old pressure lines, Annie said. He showed me the service passages when I was younger. The digital maps were created after the renovation. Some passages were filled in, but not all of them. Charles looked at her. Have you ever gone inside? Only as far as the stairs. So you haven't actually seen the room you're describing? No, sir. Richard raised both hands. You heard her. This entire story is based on a childhood memory and an old staircase. Charles kept his eyes on Annie. You just admitted that you've never been inside. So how do you know the seed vault still exists? Because its ventilation system is still running. How do you know that? The pressure gauge at the east pump station changes between midnight and 3 in the morning, but the central server data stays the same. Charles narrowed his eyes slightly. Did you record those readings? Not all of them. I only saw them while checking the irrigation lines. So this is still speculation. Yes, sir, Richard immediately said. At last, she admits it. Annie did not look at him, but it's speculation that can be tested in less than an hour. Charles turned to Daniel. Can the pressure data be accessed independently? Daniel checked the tablet. Yes, but we would have to use the control panel at the pump station. The local system only stores 7 days of data. Richard said, that isn't necessary. The central system has already confirmed that every reading is normal. Annie pointed toward the screen. If someone is interfering with the server, the central data is the least reliable source. Charles looked at Richard. Do you object to checking the local data? I object to allowing an unsupported accusation to disrupt the schedule. That wasn't my question. Richard paused. No, I don't object to an inspection. I simply think it would be pointless. Charles turned back to Annie. Suppose you're right, and there is a storage facility below us. Why would anyone hide it from the transfer agreement? It contains varieties that were never entered into the inventory, Annie replied. Drought-resistant corn, disease-resistant soybeans, and older research samples still stored under their original identification codes. Richard scoffed. That exists only in stories told by former employees. Then proving me wrong should be easy. Annie stepped closer to the table while maintaining a respectful distance. Check the pressure readings between midnight and 3 in the morning. If I'm wrong, they'll match the central system. And if they don't, Charles asked, then someone is redirecting airflow into an underground area. For what purpose? To change the temperature and humidity, without triggering the main alarms. Charles watched her closely. What would that accomplish? The seeds would deteriorate slowly, slowly enough to look like a storage failure after control had been transferred. Richard interrupted at once. That's absurd. No one would sabotage assets that valuable through a single ventilation line. It isn't only the ventilation line, Annie said. For the past 3 nights, I've smelled something unusual coming from the old return duct. At first it smells slightly sweet, then metallic. It wasn't there last month. Charles looked at Richard. Can you explain that? No, because there is nothing to explain. She could have smelled fertilizer, cleaning products, or any number of chemicals used in the greenhouses. Charles looked back at Annie. Mr. Vale is right. There are other possible explanations. Yes, sir. Then why are you certain this is sabotage? I'm not certain. The answer made both Charles and Richard pause. Annie continued. I'm only certain that someone is using a passage that was supposedly sealed. The local readings don't match the central system, and a chemical smell appears during hours when no activity is scheduled in that area. Charles remained silent. Annie had not tried to make her claim sound more certain than it was. That interested him more than all her earlier accusations. What do you want me to do? He asked. Bring your security team. Bring cameras and measuring equipment. Don't use anyone from the current operations staff. I'll show you the entrance. Why wait until tonight? The people below believe every former employee has been removed from the property. If you inspect the area openly now, they'll have time to clear everything out. Richard moved closer to the signing table. You cannot seriously be considering this. She is asking you to conduct a secret search based on a few readings she failed to record, and a smell no one else can confirm. Charles looked at the unsigned agreement. He still did not believe Annie, but he no longer believed that signing immediately was the only reasonable choice. He had built his career by moving faster than his competitors, but he had never mistaken decisiveness for blindly proceeding when an unexplained risk appeared. Charles slipped the pen into his coat pocket. Richard noticed immediately. What are you doing? Postponing the signing. Because of her story. No. Charles closed the folder. Because her claims can be tested, and because you are trying to prevent me from testing them. Richard remained silent for a moment. Agrinova will demand an explanation. Tell them we need to verify a technical issue. The delay could cause them to withdraw from the agreement. If they withdraw because I asked for a few hours to inspect an asset I just purchased, then I need to know why. Richard looked toward Annie. You're allowing an 18-year-old girl to interfere with a transaction she doesn't understand. Charles replied, No, I'm giving her a chance to prove what she's saying. He turned to Annie. Don't misunderstand me. I don't believe you yet. Annie nodded. I know. If this leads nowhere, you'll leave the property immediately. Yes, sir. And if I discover that you deliberately invented this story to apply pressure or gain something for yourself, I'll turn the matter over to my legal department. I understand. Charles studied her for several more seconds. Daniel, take Miss Brooks to the private security room. Don't use the local guards. No one is to speak with her privately until I arrive. Daniel nodded. Richard struggled to maintain his composure. Sir, you're making a serious mistake. Charles looked at him. Then by tomorrow morning, you'll have the opportunity to prove it. Annie followed Daniel toward the administrative building. As she passed Samuel, she saw him give her a slight nod. It was not a gesture of celebration. They both understood that Charles had only stopped the pen. He had not taken Annie's side. Inside the security room, Daniel placed her toolbox against the wall and gave her a cup of warm water. Annie held it in both hands but did not drink immediately. She continued looking through the small window toward Greenhouse 4. A few minutes later, Charles entered carrying the unsigned agreement. He sat across from her. You said things are being grown here that don't appear on the maps, he began. Now tell me everything in the correct order. No speculation. Don't leave anything out. Tell me only what you saw, what you heard, and what you can prove. Annie nodded. She reached inside her coat and removed an old sheet of paper, worn thin along its creases. My father drew this before he died. She unfolded it on the table. Unlike the digital plans, the old map showed a narrow passage running beneath Greenhouse 4, curving around the pump station, and ending at a room marked only by 3 handwritten letters. Charles leaned closer. What do those letters mean? Annie placed one finger beside them. Reserve seed vault. Charles looked from the paper to Annie. This map could be outdated. It could. The room may have been filled in. That's possible too. And what you heard could have been technicians performing approved work. Annie nodded. That's why you should see it for yourself. Charles leaned back in his chair. How soon can you take us to the entrance? After dark. And if there's nothing behind the wall? Annie looked at him. You can send me away. Charles paused. And if there is? Annie slowly folded the map. Then you'll know why someone wanted every former employee gone before nightfall. Charles studied the folded map while Daniel locked the security room door. The noise outside had subsided. Through the narrow window, the empty workyard lay beneath the fading afternoon light. Several cardboard boxes were scattered near the gate, abandoned by former employees as they were hurried off the property. Charles pulled out a chair and sat across from Annie. Start with the entrance, he said. Don't tell me what you think is happening. Tell me only what you know and what can be verified. Annie unfolded the map again and turned it so both Charles and Daniel could see it clearly. The old pump station is east of Greenhouse 4. The main door was welded shut, but there's still a maintenance entrance behind the fertilizer storage building. From the outside, it looks like part of the drainage system. Daniel leaned closer to study the faded lines. How does it open? There's a pressure latch beneath the lowest pipe. You have to lift the handle before turning it to the left. If you pull it directly, the lock will jam. Charles tapped one finger against the route drawn in pencil. Does this passage lead directly to the seed vault? No, it leads down to the old irrigation corridor. From there, the passage divides. The northern branch runs beneath the greenhouses. The other ends near the old cooling room. Is the cooling room still operating? It shouldn't be. Charles looked up. That wasn't my question. Annie met his Gaza. Yes, something inside is still drawing power. Daniel walked to the wall-mounted screen, opened the maintenance dashboard, and entered the code for the greenhouse section. The official report says that cooling unit was disconnected from the system 6 years ago. Check the power usage after midnight, Annie said. Daniel accessed the records from the previous 7 days. At first, the total consumption appeared completely normal. He separated the data by hour, then enlarged the period between midnight and 4 in the morning. A narrow, nearly identical spike appeared on the graph every night. Charles leaned toward the screen. How much power? Not enough to operate an entire facility, Daniel replied. But enough for ventilation, refrigeration, and a small server. Annie pointed to the repeating pattern. It begins after the night shift leaves and stops before the morning shift arrives. Charles turned toward her. You discovered this while inspecting the irrigation lines? I noticed the wall of the pump station vibrating at a time when the system was supposed to be shut down. Then I checked the pressure gauge outside Greenhouse 4. The local reading didn't match the number on the central display. Why didn't the automated system report a fault? Because the system only displays what the sensors send to it. If someone alters the output signal, the screen can show that a line has stopped operating even while it's still running. Daniel glanced at Charles. She's right. A false signal could make an active system appear to be shut down. Charles rose and walked to the window. Outside, 2 local security guards were removing Red Valley signs from the former employee's entrance. Charles had expected resistance from workers afraid of losing their jobs. He had not expected the first evidence he found to involve technical data that might have been manipulated. What else? He asked. Annie opened the map wider and traced another route with her finger. The ventilation line from the lower level connects to the return air system in the eastern greenhouse. 3 nights ago, the air coming through it smelled different. It wasn't fertilizer. It wasn't cleaning solution either. Daniel asked, Did you recognize the substance? No, I only know that smell should not have been coming through the return air line. Charles turned away from the window. That isn't enough to accuse anyone. I'm not accusing anyone. You're saying the management team concealed a seed vault. I'm saying the vault disappeared from the maps. The person who removed it from the records can explain why. The desk phone rang. Daniel looked at the small display beside it. Richard Vale. Charles held out his hand for the receiver. Where are you? Richard asked as soon as the call connected. His voice was loud enough for Annie to hear. Agrinova's legal team has arrived. The board is waiting for an update. The signing has been postponed. There was silence on the other end. For how long? Until tomorrow morning. Because of the claims made by a temporary worker who was just dismissed? Because I made the decision. Richard lowered his voice. Charles, this transaction has taken 8 months. Agrinova may walk away if we create uncertainty now. Then keep them here. I need to know what you're investigating. Charles looked at Annie before answering. There are signs of discrepancies in the asset records. There are no discrepancies. Charles narrowed his eyes slightly. That was a quick answer. I know the asset inventory. Better than the technical data? Richard did not respond immediately. Is she still with you? Annie remained still, though her fingers tightened around the edge of the map. Yes. You should remove her from the property. She has disrupted operations, threatened the transaction, and made unsupported accusations. She provided a specific location and identified unusual power consumption. Power usage proves nothing. Old agricultural equipment can draw electricity for many reasons. You said that area had been sealed. It was. Then it should not be consuming electricity. Another silence followed. When Richard spoke again, his tone had changed. You're allowing her to direct the investigation. No. I'm asking questions you should have answered before I bought Red Valley. Charles ended the call and set down the receiver. Daniel looked at him. He'll send someone to look for Annie. He already has, Annie said. Charles turned toward her. How can you be sure? Because before he asked what you had found, he asked where you were. Daniel gave a slight nod. That matters. Charles returned to the table. You said technicians used the tunnel 3 times this week. Did you see them clearly? One of them, tall, wearing gray protective clothing with no Red Valley insignia. He had a temporary access badge. Name? I don't know. Vehicle? A white delivery van parked behind the greenhouse. No company logo. Daniel entered the description into the security system. A series of camera images appeared. Most showed delivery roads, warehouses, and empty loading docks. The camera behind Greenhouse 4 displayed an empty service lane. Daniel refreshed the feed. Nothing changed. He checked again, then looked at Charles. This isn't live footage. The camera feed is looping. Charles moved closer. For how long? Daniel checked the timestamp. At least 9 hours. Annie folded her arms across her chest. That camera normally points directly at the fertilizer delivery road. Who controls the local security network? Charles asked. Richard's office, Daniel replied. Charles walked around the table and stopped in front of the monitor. Can you access the original recordings? Not from this room. I need to reach the physical recorder in the main security office. Do it without notifying the local guards. Daniel picked up the phone and quietly began giving instructions to 2 members of Charles's private security team. Annie reached for the map, but Charles placed 2 fingers on one corner of the paper. I'll keep it. No. Charles's expression hardened at once. You came here asking me to believe you. I asked you to look at the facts. That map is the only copy I have. I can protect it. The people assigned to protect the technical records could say the same thing. Daniel looked up from the phone. Charles studied Annie for several more seconds, then removed his hand. Keep it. But Daniel will photograph every section before we leave this room. Annie nodded. There was a knock at the door. One of Daniel's agents entered carrying a clear evidence bag. Inside was a metal valve tag bearing a recent inspection stamp. We just checked the east pump station, the agent said. This tag says the valve was replaced 2 weeks ago, but the manufacturing date on the valve body shows it is 17 years old. The serial number has also been worn away. Charles took the evidence bag and examined it carefully. Who signed the inspection report? The agent handed him a printed maintenance record. The final authorization line bore Richard Vale's name. Annie looked at Charles. You asked what I could prove. Charles placed the maintenance record beside the unsigned agreement. You've proved that someone falsified a repair report, and that someone is drawing electricity to operate an area officially listed as closed. Charles looked at her. Yes, that's enough reason to go down there. Charles checked his watch. Sunset was less than 3 hours away. Daniel began listing the equipment they would need. Body cameras, respirator masks, radios, flashlights, evidence bags, and a technician capable of copying data without altering the original files. No local guards, Charles said, and no one from Richard's operations team. Annie pointed to the southern entrance on the map. We shouldn't use this route. Why not? It's too obvious. If Richard knows you're inspecting the property, he'll have someone watching it. Daniel asked, Is there another way in? Annie moved her finger to the western side of the diagram. There's an abandoned pump station behind the soybean warehouse. The door looks sealed from the outside, but it can be opened from below. Charles looked at her skeptically. How many hidden entrances does this place have? More than the maps you received show. Daniel photographed the route and began organizing the team. Charles remained beside the table. You'll stay in this room until dark. Annie shook her head. I need to speak with Samuel Reed. He no longer works here. He knows which pipes below still carry pressure. I'm not bringing a recently dismissed employee into a private investigation. Without him, you could open the wrong valve and flood the corridor. The patience in Charles's voice began to wear thin. It seems every answer you give depends on people I dismissed this morning. Annie looked directly at him. That's because the people you dismissed are the ones who understand how this place works. The room fell silent. Charles did not like the answer, but he could not deny it. At last, he turned toward Daniel. Find Samuel. Take him to a diner off the property. Don't let anyone on Richard's team know. Daniel nodded. Annie folded the map and tucked it back inside her coat. As Daniel opened the door, Charles called after her. One more question. Annie stopped. Why did you wait until today to say something? I didn't. Charles looked at her. I reported the pressure changes twice. To whom? My direct supervisor. What happened afterward? After the first report, he was reassigned to another shift. Annie paused. After the second, my name appeared on the termination list. If Annie's courage to speak the truth touched your heart, please like this video, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. Charles looked toward the falsified maintenance record lying beside the contract. By 6 o'clock, the sky over Bellwether had turned the color of old steel. Daniel drove Annie and Charles away from Red Valley in an unmarked SUV, taking county roads instead of the main highway. No one spoke for the first 10 minutes. Annie sat in the back with her father's map inside her jacket. Charles occupied the passenger seat, answering messages without explaining where he was. Richard had called twice. Agranova's legal counsel had called 3 times. Charles declined every call. Daniel glanced at him. They'll know something changed. They know the signing moved. Vale will assume she caused it. Charles looked back at Annie. Did anyone see you leave the administration building? Not unless your people wanted them to. They didn't. That doesn't mean Richard won't find out. Charles put his phone away. You give him a great deal of credit. I give him the amount he's earned. They reached Miller's Diner shortly after sunset. The restaurant sat beside a truck stop at the edge of town, its red sign flickering above a row of pickups. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, fried onions, and meatloaf. A waitress filled mugs without asking and called most of the older customers by name. Samuel Reed waited in a booth near the back. His cap rested beside a plate he had barely touched. When Annie approached, he rose and checked her scraped palm before greeting anyone else. You all right, Miss Brooks? I'm fine. You don't look fine. I've looked worse after a night shift. Samuel gave Charles a brief nod. Mr. Whitmore. Charles sat across from him. You understand this conversation is confidential. Samuel lowered himself into the booth. You fired me this morning. Confidentiality isn't much of a benefit package. Daniel remained standing until he had checked the exits, then took the chair at the end of the table. Annie opened the map between the coffee mugs. We need the western route into the lower corridor. Samuel's eyes moved over the paper. Why not the east stair? Richard may be watching it. He will be. Charles noticed the certainty in his voice. Why? Because Vale ordered the east access cleaned out last month. Said there was mold. Funny thing was, he only sent men who weren't on our regular crew. Namis? Temporary contractors. Badges said Midwest Industrial Services. Daniel entered the company name into his phone. Registered address is a mailbox in Cedar Rapids. Samuel nodded, as if that confirmed what he expected. They worked nights. Wouldn't let us inspect after them. Charles asked. And you accepted that? I filed 3 objections. They went to Mr. Vale. What happened? First one disappeared. Second came back, marked resolved. After the third, my maintenance budget was cut. The waitress arrived with a pot of coffee. Samuel thanked her by name. Charles covered his cup, but she poured anyway. You look like you need it, she said. After she left, Samuel pointed to the western edge of the map. This pump house can get you down, but the lower door sticks. Lift the handle before you turn it. Don't force it. Annie gave Charles a quiet look. He noticed. You already told me. My father taught both of us. Samuel's expression changed at the mention of Marcus. He rubbed one thumb across the side of his coffee mug. Your father knew every pressure line under that property, better than anyone. Charles leaned forward. Did he know about the seed vault? He helped keep the cooling system alive after Red Valley stopped putting it on the regular maintenance schedule. Why was it removed? Samuel looked toward the diner window before answering. Officially, because the research was inactive. Unofficially, the old owners were afraid somebody would understand what those samples were worth. Annie asked, "Is the western line still pressurized?" "Part of it. The valve near the soybean building is manual. The lower branch may still carry runoff from the greenhouse cooling system." "What happens if we open the wrong one?" Daniel asked. "You flood the corridor." Charles looked at Annie. "That explains your insistence on bringing him." Samuel gave a dry smile. "Some things don't improve just because the owner changes." Charles accepted the remark without answering. Annie traced the route. "Where does this split?" "About 40 yards past the first ladder. North takes you toward Greenhouse 4. South runs to the old cooling room. Don't take the south branch unless you have respirators." Daniel asked why. "Poor ventilation, rust in the pipes, maybe chemical residue. We sealed it off years ago." "Who ordered it reopened?" Annie asked. Samuel's eyes lifted. "How do you know it was?" "The wall vibrates after midnight." Samuel leaned back. "Then Vale brought the cooling room online." Charles asked. "What would he need it for?" "Independent refrigeration, separate airflow, a place to run equipment without the main system showing the load." Daniel looked at Charles. "It matches the electrical pattern." The waitress returned with Annie's sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Samuel must have ordered it before they arrived. Annie started to refuse, but he pushed the plate toward her. "Eat. Your father used to forget meals whenever a machine acted wrong. We don't have much time. You'll have less if you get dizzy underground." Annie took a bite while Charles studied the hand-drawn map. He seemed uncomfortable with how much of the conversation depended on people he had removed that morning. Samuel reached into his coat and placed an old brass key on the table. "This opens the maintenance cabinet inside the western pump house. Behind it is the lower release." Daniel picked up the key with a napkin. "Who else has one?" "Marcus had the second. Vale ordered the locks changed after he died, but the cabinet was too old for the new cylinder. They changed the outside plate and left the inside mechanism." Charles asked, "Why didn't you report that?" "To Vale?" "To the board." Samuel looked at him. "Working men don't call boards, Mr. Whitmore. We report to supervisors. Supervisors report to managers. Managers decide whether our words get upstairs. That is going to change." Samuel did not respond. Charles held his gaze. "You don't believe me. I believe you mean it right now. Men with money often mean things right up until those things cost money." Annie watched Charles absorb the comment. He had been challenged by employees before, but Samuel spoke without anger. That made the words harder to dismiss. Daniel's phone vibrated. He read the message and turned the screen toward Charles. The local security recorder had been accessed remotely at 5:42 p.m. The camera feed behind Greenhouse 4 had been erased, along with 4 hours of loading bay footage. "Who had permission?" Charles asked. "Vale and 2 security administrators," Daniel said. "One administrator clocked out before noon. The other is on leave." Samuel looked at Annie. "He knows?" Charles stood. "Then we go now." Annie folded the map and finished the last bite of her sandwich. Samuel reached for his cap. "I'm coming." "No," Charles said. "You've given us the route." Samuel rose anyway. "I've also given you the warning that one wrong valve can fill that corridor. Paper won't tell you which wheel sticks." Daniel looked at Charles. "He's useful." "He's 64. Samuel put on his cap. "That's not a medical condition." Annie almost smiled. Charles considered the old mechanic, then gave one condition. "You follow Daniel's orders." Samuel looked at Daniel. "Are they sensible?" "Usually." "Then we'll get along." Outside, the wind had picked up. As they crossed the parking lot, Annie's phone rang. Ruth's name appeared on the screen. Annie answered. "You coming home?" Ruth asked. "Late." "How late?" "I don't know." A pause followed. Ruth had spent years learning when Annie was hiding fear behind short answers. "Are you with the rich man?" Annie looked toward Charles, who was speaking with Daniel near the SUV. "Yes." "Has he offered your job back?" "No." "Good." Annie frowned. "Good?" "A job can make a person grateful before anything has been made right. Don't confuse being heard once with being respected." "I won't." "And eat something." "I did." "What?" "A turkey sandwich. Then at least one person around you has sense." The call ended. Charles opened the rear door for Annie, an act so ordinary that neither of them mentioned it. Samuel climbed in beside her, carrying a small canvas tool bag. Before Daniel started the engine, Charles's phone rang again. This time he answered. Richard spoke without greeting. "Where are you?" "Reviewing the inventory discrepancy." "With whom?" Charles looked through the windshield at the diner sign. "People who understand the property. You need to return. Agranova is threatening to withdraw." "Let them threaten." "Charles, that contract protects the acquisition. Then it will survive one night." Richard's voice hardened. "Is Annie Brooks with you?" Charles let the silence stretch. "Why are you asking about her again?" "Because she has no reason to be involved." "That isn't what I asked." Richard recovered quickly. "I'm trying to protect you from a public embarrassment." Charles looked back at Annie. "Save your concern for tomorrow." He ended the call. At Red Valley, Richard lowered his phone and turned toward a technician waiting inside the operations office. "They're going underground," he said. "Move everything before midnight." The technician asked what to do with the seed samples. Richard looked at the clock. "Finish the treatment, then wipe the server." 20 minutes later, Daniel turned off the county road and drove without headlights along the edge of the harvested soybean field. The abandoned pump house appeared ahead as a dark shape beside the storage building. Annie felt the old brass key in Samuel's hand and the folded map against her chest. The building had no listed electrical service, no active equipment, and no place in Charles Whitmore's digital inventory. Yet from beneath the ground came a steady mechanical hum. Daniel killed the engine 50 yards from the pump house. For a few seconds, no one moved. The mechanical hum beneath the ground carried through the floor of the SUV, faint but steady. "That building is supposed to be dead," Charles said. Samuel opened his canvas tool bag. "Dead buildings don't draw power." Daniel handed out body cameras, flashlights, respirators, and radios. 2 members of his private team had followed in a second vehicle and now moved toward the storage building to secure the outside route. "No lights until we're inside," Daniel said. "No one separates from the group. If we find people below, we record first and act only when I give the order." Samuel clipped the radio to his coat. "And if the corridor starts filling with water, then you give the order." Annie led them behind the soybean storage building. Dry stalks scraped across the concrete in the wind. The pump house stood low against the field, its windows covered with plywood, and its metal door crossed by a rusted chain. Daniel examined the lock. "Recently opened." Charles looked at the chain. "It looks untouched. Dust is missing around the link. Someone handled it today." Samuel crouched beside the lower hinge and pulled away a strip of dried weeds. Beneath them was a small access plate. "The chain is for people who use the door," he said. "We're not using the door." He inserted the brass key, turned it halfway, then pressed the plate inward. A narrow section of wall released with a soft click. Charles gave Annie a look. "Another entrance that isn't on the map. That's why we came." They entered one at a time. The air smelled of oil, old concrete, and standing water. Samuel closed the panel behind them while Daniel checked the room. The pump house contained equipment that appeared abandoned, but Annie saw fresh marks on the floor where something heavy had recently been moved. A thin cable ran behind a row of disconnected control boxes. Daniel followed it with his flashlight. "New wiring." Samuel touched the insulation. "Installed badly." Charles lowered his voice. "Can you tell where it goes?" "Down." Annie crossed to a metal cadaver built into the far wall. He reached beneath the cabinet. The inner panel opened. Behind it stood a red iron handle. "Lift first," Annie said. Samuel nodded. "Your father taught you well." Charles watched as Daniel aimed his flashlight down. "How far?" 20 feet to the first landing," Samuel said. "Maybe more if the lower floor is settled." Annie went first. Charles caught her arm before she stepped onto the ladder. "Daniel leads. He doesn't know which landing is safe." Daniel looked between them. "She leads. I stay one rung behind." Charles released her. The ladder ended at a narrow concrete platform. Annie waited until Daniel joined her, then pointed toward 2 corridors. Water covered the floor of the left passage. The right remained dry. Samuel descended next and checked a pressure gauge fixed to the wall. "Western line is active," he said. "Higher than it should be." "Can we still pass?" Daniel asked. "If nobody touches the blue wheels." Charles came down last. The steel ladder shifted slightly under his weight. His shoe slipped on the final rung, and Annie caught his sleeve. "Put your foot against the wall," she said. "Not straight down." He followed her instruction and reached the floor. I could have managed. I know. Her answer gave him nothing to argue with. They moved through the right corridor. The ceiling forced Charles to lower his head. Pipes ran along both walls, some marked with faded paint, others carrying fresh labels. Annie stopped beside a junction where 3 lines crossed. This label is wrong. Samuel raised his light. Cooling return marked as wastewater. Could be a mistake, Charles said. Samuel scraped the edge of the label with one fingernail. It peeled away, exposing older lettering beneath. Not a mistake. Daniel photographed both layers. The hum grew louder as they continued. Annie counted doors under her breath. At the 4th one, she stopped. My father's map shows a split here. There was no visible opening, only a wall covered in gray panels. Charles checked the digital plan on Daniel's tablet. It shows solid foundation. Annie pressed her palm against the panels one by one. The 3rd vibrated. Here. Daniel examined the seams. No handle. Lower right corner. He found a small recessed lever near the floor. The panel released, opening into a steel stairwell. Cold air rose from below. Charles tightened the collar of his coat. How deep does this go? Far enough that the old owners didn't want weather reaching it, Samuel said. They descended 2 flights. Halfway down, Annie stopped so suddenly that Daniel almost stepped into her. What is it? She lifted one hand. A sweet smell drifted through the stairwell, followed by something metallic. Samuel's expression changed. That isn't from refrigeration. Annie adjusted her respirator but did not move. Daniel spoke quietly. You can wait here. No. You don't have to prove anything by going farther. It's not about proving anything. She took another step. Charles noticed her hand shaking near the rail. What do you recognize? The same smell was in the maintenance corridor the week my father died. Samuel looked toward the floor. Daniel gave her a moment. Can you continue? Annie drew a slow breath. I'm scared of what's down there. I'm more scared of what happens if we leave. They continued. At the bottom, the stairwell ended behind a row of industrial panels. Through a narrow gap, Daniel saw white light. He signaled for silence. Voices came from the other side. Transfer is at 68%, a man said. Another answered, Vale wants it finished before the signing. Charles's face hardened. Annie guided them to a small inspection window clouded by dust. Daniel wiped one corner clean. Inside the vault, 2 technicians in gray coveralls moved between rows of sealed seed containers. One inserted a syringe into a ventilation port on a storage tray. The other worked at a server cabinet where a black device had been connected beneath the control panel. On a nearby screen, files were moving to an external address. Samuel whispered, They're changing the samples. Annie pointed to a temperature graph, and lowering the room 1 section at a time, slow enough to avoid the main alarm. Daniel activated his body camera and motioned for the others to do the same. Charles watched a technician remove an old Red Valley label and replace it with a new code. How many samples are in there? He asked. Thousands, Annie whispered. Maybe more. Value? Helen had not yet examined them, but Annie knew enough to answer. More than the contract you were about to sign. Daniel checked the door. I can take them now. Annie caught his wrist. Not yet. He looked at her. That device could wipe the server if they disconnected. The cooling system may also be tied to the same control. If you rush in, they can destroy the evidence and the seed together. Charles looked through the glass again. What do you need? Annie examined the gauges beside the door. The main airflow has to be isolated first. Then Daniel can enter while Samuel holds the pressure steady. And me? She pointed to a row of numbered switches. You read those temperatures out loud. If any section drops more than 2 degrees, you tell me. Charles looked at the switches, then at her. For the next 5 minutes, Annie said, you need to stop being the owner and do exactly what I say. A technician inside the vault turned toward the door. The indicator above the control panel changed from green to red. Daniel reached for his weapon. They know we're here, he said. From inside came the sound of a lock releasing. The lock snapped open, and the steel door moved inward. Daniel pushed Charles behind the wall and stepped to the side of the entrance. Samuel reached for the pressure panel, while Annie turned toward the red iron valve mounted beside the door. Which line? Daniel asked. The upper one should isolate the vault. Should? Annie placed both hands on the wheel. That's how it was built. Inside, one of the technicians shouted, Who's out there? The second man pulled the black device from the server cabinet and ran toward a rear passage. Stop, Daniel called. The first technician struck a control on the wall. A warning tone spread through the vault. On the display, the temperatures in 4 storage sections began falling. Annie forced the valve around. It resisted, then turned. The warning became louder. Samuel checked the nearest gauge. Pressure's rising. That's not supposed to happen, Annie said. You closed the return instead of the intake. The pipes above them began to vibrate. Annie released the wheel. They changed the route. Daniel glanced through the doorway. Can you fix it? Yes, but not from here. The technician inside grabbed a metal case and ran between the storage rows. Daniel entered after him, followed by one of his agents. The second agent moved toward the rear passage, but the man carrying the black device had already disappeared through a closing fire door. Annie ran to the pressure panel. 3 faded labels had been covered with newer printed tags. She tore one away and found different lettering beneath it. Samuel joined her. Blue line used to feed the intake. It doesn't now. Look at the gauge response. The pressure needle trembled near the red section. Annie followed the pipes with her flashlight until she found a narrow bypass running behind the server cabinets. There, Samuel saw it. Manual release. The handle was inside the vault. Charles reached for the door. Daniel turned. Stay where you are. The temperature readings are dropping. Read them from there. Charles looked at the numbered display. Section 1 is down 1 degree. Section 2 is down 1.5. Annie moved inside. Cold air crossed the floor around her boots. She passed rows of sealed trays, found the bypass handle, and pulled. Nothing happened. It's locked, she said. Samuel pointed through the doorway. Lift it before turning. Annie raised the handle and twisted. The pipe knocked once. Then the pressure needle began to fall. Charles read the display again. Section 2 is holding. Section 3 is still dropping. By how much? 2 degrees. Annie crossed to a second control wheel near the cooling unit. She turned it a quarter rotation. The temperature stopped falling. Samuel watched the gauges. Hold it there. The first technician reached the far end of the room, but Daniel's agent blocked the exit. He tried to reverse direction and slipped between 2 carts. Daniel caught his arm and brought him against the wall without striking him. Hands where I can see them. I'm a contractor, the man said. I don't know anything. Then this will be a short conversation. Annie kept one hand on the wheel. The external transfer is still running. Charles checked the server display. 74%. Daniel looked toward the rear fire door. The other man has the control device. If he disconnects it wrong, the server may erase the local files, Annie said. Can we stop the transfer here? Not without knowing what he installed. Charles moved toward the cabinet. Don't touch it, Annie said. He stopped. She pointed to a row of switches. Read the temperatures. Charles returned to the display. Section 1 stable. Section 2 stable. Section 3 rising 0.5 degree. Section 4 down 1. Samuel adjusted a smaller valve. That should balance it. The warning tone stopped, but the transfer continued. Daniel secured the captured technician's wrists and checked his badge. The name printed on it was Alan Pierce. The badge carried no Red Valley logo. Who hired you? Daniel asked. A contracting company. Which company? Midwest Industrial Services. Samuel gave a quiet breath. The mailbox company. Pierce said nothing. Daniel pointed toward the trays. What did you inject? Preservative. Annie looked at the syringes left on the cart. Preservative doesn't go through the ventilation ports. Pierce turned his face away. Charles approached him. You have one chance to explain why you were altering property I purchased this morning. Pierce gave a strained laugh. You think you purchased everything down here? Charles did not react. Who gave the order? I follow work tickets. From Richard Vale? Pierce's eyes moved toward the camera on Daniel's chest, then back to the floor. That small reaction was enough. Daniel said, We'll preserve the question for later. Annie left Samuel holding the pressure steady and went to the server cabinet. The black device remained connected by 2 cables even though the main control unit had been removed. Can you copy the data? Charles asked. Maybe. Not with the tools we brought. Daniel, I can have a forensic technician here within an hour. Annie checked the status screen. We may not have an hour. The transfer reached 78%. Samuel came closer without leaving the gauge. Can you cut the network line? If it's tied to the temperature controls, cutting it could trigger the same shutdown. Charles looked at the storage rows. How many samples are at risk? Annie read the handwritten codes. At least 600 active strains in this section. There could be thousands in the other rooms. Charles's voice lowered. And if they're damaged? Some can't be recreated. Pierce spoke from beside Daniel. They're just seeds. Helen Ward's words had not yet been heard in that room, but Annie already knew the answer. No, she said. They're years people don't get back. Daniel sent one agent through the rear passage after the second technician. The agent returned several minutes later. He reached a maintenance lift. The upper door was open. We found tire marks near the North Service Road. The white van, Annie said. Daniel called his outside team and ordered every exit watched. Charles looked toward the server. Can Vale access this remotely? Probably, Daniel said. Annie examined the cables again. One led to the vault controls. The other disappeared behind a panel marked as an inactive communications line. She removed the screws with a driver from her toolbox. Behind the panel, the cable split into two branches. One sends data out, she said. The other carries control commands back in, Charles asked. Can you isolate one without stopping the other? I think so. Samuel looked at her. Think? She met his eyes. The labels are false, and the route has been changed. I made one wrong choice already. That means you check twice this time. Annie traced both lines by hand. One cable felt warm from active transmission. The second carried an intermittent vibration from the control signal. She marked the control cable with tape. If I disconnect this one, the transfer may continue, but they can't change the temperatures from outside. And if you're wrong, Charles asked, the vault shuts down. No one spoke. Annie looked at the readings, then at the pipe route, then back at the cables. She could feel everyone waiting for certainty she did not have. I need Samuel on the release valve. Charles, keep reading every section. Daniel, if the display goes blank, reconnect the cable immediately. Charles nodded. Annie pulled the control line. The lights flickered once. The temperature display remained active. Samuel checked the gauge, pressure steady. Charles read the sections, all holding. The external transfer stopped at 81%. Daniel released a breath. Good call. Annie shook her head. Not finished. The server screen displayed a new message. Remote wipe pending. A countdown appeared beneath it. 9 minutes and 59 seconds. Charles looked at Pierce. Who can stop that? Pierce remained silent. Daniel moved closer. Your partner left you here. Vale will erase the system, and every record will make it look like you acted alone. Pierce's expression changed. The timer reached 9 minutes and 40 seconds. Annie looked at the black device, then toward the passage where the second technician had escaped. We need the control unit, he took. Daniel spoke into his radio, ordering every team toward the North Service Road. Charles watched the timer continue to fall. They had found the hidden vault, interrupted the sabotage, and caught one man inside it. None of that would matter if the records disappeared before they could prove who had sent him. Above them, Richard Vale still believed the contract would be signed in the morning. Below ground, Annie had less than 10 minutes to keep the truth alive. The timer dropped below 9 minutes. Annie crouched in front of the open server panel while Daniel stood behind Alan Pierce. Samuel remained at the pressure controls, and Charles continued reading the storage temperatures in a steady voice. Section 1 holding. Section 2 holding. Section 3 up 1 degree. Section 4 stable. Pierce kept his eyes on the floor. Daniel leaned closer. Your partner took the control unit. Where would he go? I don't know. You knew enough to enter a hidden vault. I followed instructions. From Vale? Pierce said nothing. The timer reached 8 minutes and 30 seconds. Annie examined the remaining cables. The remote wipe command had entered the local server before she disconnected the control line. Cutting the network had stopped new instructions, but the countdown was now running inside the system. Can you cancel it? Charles asked. Not from this screen. Why not? The command has administrator-level access. We need either the control unit or a local override key. Samuel called from the gauges. There used to be an emergency maintenance terminal in the cooling room. Annie looked at him. South Branch? Yes. You said it was sealed. It was. Vale may have reopened that too. Daniel checked his radio. His outside team had found the white van abandoned near the North Service Road. No driver. No control unit. How far to the cooling room? Charles asked. Samuel pointed toward the rear passage. 5 minutes if the corridor is clear. The timer showed 7 minutes and 51 seconds. Then we go, Annie said. Daniel shook his head. You stay here. I know the route. Samuel knows it. Samuel needs to hold the pressure. Charles looked at Daniel. She goes. You stay close. Daniel secured Pierce to a steel support with one of his agents beside him, then followed Annie and Charles through the rear passage. Samuel called after them. Second intersection. Take the lower corridor. Don't open any red-marked doors. Annie turned back. What about unmarked doors? Samuel gave her a tired look. Use better judgment than the people who removed the labels. The corridor narrowed beyond the first bend. Condensation covered the concrete walls. Daniel checked the air with a portable meter before allowing them forward. Safe for now, he said. Charles kept one hand near the wall. How did Red Valley operate with this much infrastructure missing from the records? It didn't go missing all at once, Annie said. Someone stopped updating one section, then another. After a while, people treated the missing information as normal. That sounds inefficient. It was useful to whoever wanted no one asking questions. They reached the second intersection. The upper corridor had fresh scrape marks on the floor, likely from the escaped technician. Annie chose the lower route. The timer on Daniel's tablet showed 6 minutes and 40 seconds. A steel gate blocked the corridor ahead. Its electronic panel was dark. Daniel examined the lock. No power. Annie found a manual release box beside the frame. It had been painted over. She scraped the edge with the flat side of a screwdriver. Charles watched her work. You've opened many doors like this? I've cleaned around them. That's how you learn which ones people use even when they say they don't. The cover came free. Inside were 2 levers and a row of old fuses. Which one? Daniel asked. Annie looked at the faded markings. Neither. The release is behind the fuse rail. She lifted the rail and found a small metal pull. The gate opened several inches, enough for Daniel to force it wider. Beyond it, the air became colder. The hum of machinery grew louder. The cooling room door stood open. Inside, 3 refrigeration units lined the wall. Only one was active. A maintenance terminal sat near the center, its screen displaying the same countdown, 5 minutes and 23 seconds. Annie crossed to it and pressed a key. The system requested an override code. Charles asked, Do you know it? No. Daniel searched the room. Could Vale have changed it? Probably. Charles took out his phone, then remembered there was no signal below ground. What about the original manufacturer? No time. Annie studied the terminal. Beneath the digital keypad was a narrow slot marked Mechanical Service Access. She reached into her jacket and removed her father's employee badge. Daniel looked at it. That won't fit. The badge won't. Annie bent the plastic sleeve and pulled out a thin metal strip attached behind the card. One end carried a series of punched notches. Charles moved closer. What is that? An old maintenance key. You've carried it all this time? My father's badge was returned with it still attached. She inserted the strip into the slot. The terminal clicked. A second menu opened, asking for a 4-digit service code. 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Annie tried Marcus's employee number. The screen rejected it. She tried the last 4 digits of the pump station identification number. Rejected. Daniel glanced toward the door. One more attempt before it locks us out. Charles studied the handwritten labels above the refrigeration units. Your father marked systems by date, didn't he? Sometimes. What date mattered here? Annie looked at the old map she had unfolded on a workbench. Near the seed reserve, Marcus had written 4 small numbers beside a circle, 0712. She entered them. The service menu opened. Daniel released a breath. What does it mean? The day the reserve first went online. The timer showed 3 minutes and 58 seconds. Annie searched the options. Most were diagnostic controls. The wipe command did not appear. Nothing here, she said. Charles pointed to a line reading, Legacy Recovery Mode. It could restore factory settings. Would that erase the research? Not if the data vault is separate. Is it? I don't know. Daniel spoke from beside her. We have 3 minutes. What happens if we do nothing? The evidence disappears. And if you choose wrong, we may lose local access to the records. Charles looked at Annie. What would your father have checked? She studied the screen again. Whether the system keeps backups before recovery. She opened the diagnostic log. A line near the bottom showed an automatic mirror copy every 12 hours. The most recent backup had completed at 6 p.m., before the technicians began the transfer. The research data is backed up, she said. The sabotage logs may not be. So recovery protects the seed records but could destroy the evidence, Charles said. Yes. Daniel checked his radio. No control unit had been found. 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Charles looked at the countdown, then at Annie. Protect the evidence. She turned toward him. That could put the company's research at risk. The backup protects most of it. Most isn't all. And if Vale walks away, he does this again somewhere else. Annie understood the choice. Saving the company's assets mattered, but proving who had tried to destroy them mattered too. She opened the system log and noticed a command history export option. We don't need the whole server. She connected Daniel's body camera storage cable to the maintenance terminal. What are you doing? He asked. Copying the command log only. It's small enough. The progress bar moved slowly. 1 minute and 40 seconds. 30%. 52. The wipe timer reached 1 minute. Charles read the numbers aloud without being asked. 45 seconds. The export reached 87%, then stopped. Daniel checked the cable. Why did it freeze? The system is trying to close the log. Annie held the connector in place and reopened the service session. 20 seconds. The export completed. Got it, she said. The countdown reached 5. Daniel disconnected the storage device. The terminal went dark. For a moment, every refrigeration unit stopped. Then the emergency lights came on, and the backup cooling system started with a low mechanical rumble. Daniel checked the copied file. Command history, remote addresses, administrator ID. Charles looked at the first name listed on the screen, Richard Vale. Annie rested both hands on the terminal, breathing evenly again. They had not recovered the missing control unit, and part of the local server had been erased. But Richard's name was now attached to the command that tried to destroy it. Daniel secured the storage device inside an evidence pouch. This is enough to start. Annie looked toward the corridor. Not enough to finish. Charles nodded. Then we keep him believing he's still ahead. Above ground, Richard was waiting for confirmation that the vault had gone silent. Charles took out his phone as soon as the signal returned near the stairwell. He called Richard. When Richard answered, Charles said, "The signing goes forward tomorrow morning." Annie turned toward him. Charles ended the call and met her questioning expression. He wanted the system erased before I signed, he said. Now we give him a reason to come collect what he thinks is left. From the vault behind them, Samuel's voice came over the radio. Temperatures are steady. Seeds are holding. Annie looked at the dark passage leading back to the surface. They had saved the samples for one night. By morning, they would have to save Red Valley in front of everyone Richard had prepared to deceive. By 3 in the morning, the group had returned to the administration building through the western pump house. Daniel placed the copied command log inside a locked evidence case, then assigned 2 agents to guard it. Samuel remained below with one of the security officers to monitor the vault. Charles ordered the local security network isolated from Richard's office without announcing why. Annie sat at the end of the conference table with her father's map folded beside her. She had not slept, and dried dust marked the sleeves of her work jacket. Helen Ward arrived carrying a thermos and a paper bag from the diner. You need food before anyone asks you another question, Helen said. I'm not hungry. That has never stopped a person from needing breakfast. She placed a turkey sandwich in front of Annie, then opened the evidence photographs Daniel had printed from the vault. Charles entered with 4 senior advisors from Whitmore Capital. They wore clean coats and carried tablets. None had been underground. One of them, Martin Cole, handed Annie an empty coffee cup as he passed. Black, no sugar, he said. Annie looked at the cup, then at him. Daniel took it from her hand and set it on the table. Miss Brooks is part of the investigation. Martin's face changed. Of course. I assumed she was staff. She was staff, Annie said, until yesterday morning. Charles took his seat at the head of the table. We have evidence that Red Valley's seed vault was sabotaged and that Richard Vale authorized a remote wipe. Helen placed several photographs on the table. We also have hundreds of research samples that would have been damaged if Annie had not found the vault. A financial advisor named Paul Mercer skimmed the photographs. How certain are we that these samples have the value Dr. Ward claims? Helen adjusted her glasses. I developed some of them myself. Paul turned to Charles. Even so, we should avoid letting a local employment dispute affect the Agranova transaction. Annie spoke before Charles could answer. Someone injected chemicals into active samples and connected an outside device to the server. That isn't an employment dispute. Paul did not address her. He looked at Daniel instead. Can your team verify that? Daniel answered. The body camera footage shows it clearly. Martin tapped the hand-drawn map. Where did this come from? My father, Annie said. And your father was? Maintenance. Martin looked toward Helen. Can we confirm the route independently? Helen did not hide her irritation. She led 5 people through it. I'm asking whether the map is reliable. Annie leaned back slightly. You believed the digital map until it failed. Now you need 3 people with titles to confirm the paper one. Martin closed his tablet. Miss Brooks, no one is questioning your effort. You're questioning everything else. Charles raised a hand. Let's remain focused. Annie turned toward him. Focused on what? Every time I explain something, they ask a man beside me whether I'm right. Paul frowned. This is a billion-dollar acquisition. Verification is not an insult. No, verification means checking the evidence. This is deciding I can't understand what I found because I'm 18, because I wore a maintenance jacket into your meeting, or because I don't look like the people you usually trust. The room went still. Martin looked at Charles. Are we really putting a billion-dollar acquisition in the hands of that girl? Charles did not answer at once. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but Annie heard the answer inside it. He had followed her underground. He had watched her protect the vault. Yet in a room filled with men who advised him, he still hesitated to defend the value of her voice. She stood and gathered the map. Charles looked up. Where are you going? You already have the command log. I need you here. Being kept in the room isn't the same as being heard. She moved toward the door. Annie, Charles said. She stopped, but did not turn. Charles faced Martin. Her name is Annie Brooks. She found what every report placed in front of us failed to show. You will speak to her directly, and you will stop asking other people to explain her own work. Martin's expression tightened. I meant no offense. Annie turned back. Intent doesn't change who has to carry it. Charles dismissed the advisors. Paul began to protest. But Daniel opened the door and waited until all 4 had left. Only Annie, Charles, Daniel, and Helen remained. Charles stood beside the window. Dawn had not yet reached the fields, but the eastern sky had begun to lighten. I should have stopped that sooner, he said. Yes, I'm trying to protect the investigation. You were protecting the comfort of people who didn't want me in the room. He looked at her. That is not what I intended. People with power talk about intent because they rarely have to live with the result. Helen quietly poured coffee into a paper cup and handed it to Daniel. Neither interrupted. Charles walked to the security monitor. Daniel had loaded the recording from the gate onto the screen. Charles pressed play. The image showed the workers gathered outside Red Valley. Richard gave the order. Guards moved into the crowd. Samuel protested. Marlene Parker reached for her purse. Annie turned toward the maintenance building and was caught by the arm. Then she was pushed to the pavement in front of Charles. The recording showed him doing nothing. Charles stopped the video. I didn't order that, he said. Annie's voice remained calm. No, you just stood close enough for everyone to believe you approved. I thought intervening would make the crowd harder to control. You mean you thought silence kept you neutral? He looked again at the frozen image on the monitor. Silence only protects the person already holding the boot, Annie said. Charles took off his glasses and placed them on the table. My father lost our farm when I was 16. The bank officer came with paperwork and a county deputy. He never raised his voice. Never insulted us. He stood on the porch while we carried our things outside. Annie said nothing. I spent my life making sure no one could ever stand over me that way again, Charles continued. I did not notice when I became the man on the porch. That doesn't make what happened right. No. It doesn't give those people their jobs back. No. And it doesn't make me trust you. Charles accepted each answer. I'm sorry, he said. Annie placed the folded map on the table but kept her hand over it. An apology tells me you saw it. What you do next tells me whether it mattered. Daniel's phone vibrated. He read the message and turned the screen toward Charles. The local security recorder showed a new access attempt from Richard's credentials. He had also requested Annie's employment file, her address, and the incident report concerning Marcus Brooks. Charles's attention shifted to the last item. Why would he request her father's record now? Annie felt the question before she answered it. Because he knows my father left something behind. Helen looked at her. What kind of thing? I don't know. Samuel kept some of his maintenance papers after the accident. Charles reached for his phone. Then we find them before Richard does. Annie picked up the map. You don't get to lock me out of that part. I wasn't going to. You hesitated. Charles met her eyes. I'm learning not to. Outside, the first gray light spread across the harvested fields. Richard still believed the evidence under Red Valley had been erased, but he had begun searching for the records of a dead maintenance worker. That told Annie the secret beneath Greenhouse 4 was only one part of what he had buried. Samuel kept Marcus Brooks's papers in a storage unit behind an abandoned repair shop on the south side of Bellwether. By 7 that morning, Daniel had secured the building and checked the surrounding lot. Charles parked near the entrance while Annie waited beside Samuel beneath a faded sign advertising tractor parts. You never told me you kept his records, Annie said. Samuel fitted a key into the padlock. You were 15 when he died. I'm 18 now, and until yesterday, Vale had the power to fire anyone who spoke his name too loudly. He fired everyone anyway. Samuel opened the metal door. That's why we're here. The unit contained 2 workbenches, several crates of machine parts, and a green tool chest marked with Marcus's initials. Samuel pulled it toward the light. Annie rested her hand on the lid but did not open it. Charles remained near the doorway. Did Richard know this existed? No, Samuel said. But if he requested Marcus's incident report this morning, he may know there was more than the official file. Daniel checked the lock and hinges. No sign anyone entered before us. Samuel lifted the lid. Inside were maintenance logs, photographs, invoices, old inspection tags, and a small cassette recorder wrapped in a shop towel. A sealed envelope lay beneath them with Annie's name written across the front. She reached for it. Samuel stopped her gently. There may be things in these papers you don't want to read with an audience. Annie looked at Charles and Daniel. They need the evidence. The evidence and the letter aren't the same thing. She removed the envelope and placed it inside her jacket. I'll read that later. Daniel photographed the position of every item before anything was moved. Helen joined them several minutes later with a portable scanner and evidence sleeves. She greeted Samuel, then looked at Annie. Have you slept? No. That was not a difficult question. We don't have time. Helen opened her equipment case. People who say that usually make mistakes because they're tired. Annie accepted the cup of coffee Helen handed her but did not drink it. Samuel opened the first maintenance log. Marcus's handwriting filled the pages in short entries. Pressure readings, replacement dates, valve numbers, unusual smells, incomplete repairs. He had marked several pages with red pencil. Daniel read one aloud. Pressure valve E14 replaced with non-standard part. Reported to operations. Immediate correction recommended. Helen checked the date. 6 weeks before the incident. The next page contained a copy of the work order. The original replacement part had cost more than $4,000. The installed part cost less than $600. Charles examined the invoice. Who approved the substitution? Samuel turned the paper over. Richard Vale's signature appeared at the bottom. Charles said nothing. Annie found a second report. Marcus had written that the cheaper valve could fail under sustained pressure and should not be used near the chemical return line. Stamped across the page were the words "Resolved, no action required." Who marked it resolved? Annie asked. Samuel pointed to a small authorization code. Vale's office. Daniel placed the report in an evidence sleeve. This connects him to the unsafe part. It doesn't prove he caused the accident. There's more, Samuel said. He removed the cassette recorder from the tool chest. Marcus started recording meetings after reports disappeared. He said a maintenance worker needed proof that couldn't be rewritten upstairs. Daniel inspected the tape. Do you have a player? Samuel reached beneath the workbench and brought out an old portable recorder. He inserted the cassette and pressed play. Static filled the unit, followed by Marcus's voice. The E14 valve cannot remain in service. If the pressure rises during a cleaning cycle, the housing may fail. Richard answered from farther away. The inspection says it passed. The inspection was done before the substitution. You signed the maintenance release. I signed that the line reopened. I did not approve the part. You're splitting words. I'm trying to keep someone from walking into a leak. A chair moved across the floor. Richard's voice became clearer. You're a maintenance man, Marcus. Don't confuse knowing the pipes with knowing the business. Marcus replied. The business dies if the pipes do. The recording ended. Annie stood still beside the workbench. Charles looked at Samuel. How long after this did Marcus die? 17 days. Was he assigned alone? Yes. The official report says he entered the area without authorization. Samuel's mouth tightened. Vale called him in. Then he removed the dispatch entry. Daniel asked, "Can you prove that?" Samuel opened another folder. Inside was a handwritten shift log signed by 3 workers. Marcus had been requested at 9:18 p.m. The entry had later been crossed out, but the original writing remained visible beneath the ink. One of these witnesses still lives in town, Samuel said. Another moved to Minnesota. The third died last year. Charles turned to Annie. This could reopen the investigation. Could? The documents need authentication. Witnesses need interviews. The recording has to be examined. Annie picked up the cassette recorder. We have his voice. We have Vale's voice. We have the part, the invoice, and the work order. And if we release it now, Charles said, Vale will claim it was altered. He'll leave before authorities can secure the rest. He has already had 3 years. I know. No, you know the number. I know what 3 years feels like. Charles did not defend himself. Annie looked toward Helen. Send the recording to the press. Helen hesitated. Not yet. Annie's expression hardened. You two? I want Richard Vale charged, not merely embarrassed. If this becomes a television argument before the evidence is secured, his lawyers will turn every fact into a question. Waiting always seems reasonable to the people who aren't the ones being asked to wait. Charles stepped closer. I'm not protecting the transaction. You kept the signing alive. To draw him out. You're still using his schedule. I'm using his confidence. And if he disappears before then, Daniel's team is monitoring the roads and airport. Annie shook her head. Justice that asks the powerless to wait always seems to move faster for the powerful. Samuel closed the maintenance log. Your father said something like that once, he said. He wanted to take the tape straight to the county attorney. I told him to wait until we had the original invoices. Annie looked at him. Did waiting help? No. The answer settled over the room. Samuel removed his cap. I've asked myself for 3 years whether I helped Vale by asking Marcus to be careful. Maybe I did. But rushing out with half a case now won't bring your father back. It may only warn the man who sent him into that room. Annie looked down at the workbench. Justice isn't fair in the way rain is fair, Samuel continued. It doesn't fall on everybody the same. That's why somebody has to carry water to the people left dry. She finally opened the envelope addressed to her. The letter inside was only 1 page. Annie read it without speaking. Marcus had written that he wanted her to finish school, not so she could escape people who worked with their hands, but so she could enter the rooms where decisions were made and refuse to let those people be ignored. At the bottom he had written, knowing how something works gives you a duty to speak when someone tries to break it. Annie folded the page. I'll wait until the evidence is secured, she said, not until it becomes convenient. Charles nodded. Agreed. Daniel's phone vibrated. He checked the message from the agent guarding Alan Pierce. Pierce's confiscated phone had received a new text from Richard's private number. Daniel placed the screen where everyone could see it. Blame the girl. Police arrive at noon. Annie read the words twice. Charles reached for his phone, but Daniel stopped him. If we react now, Vale knows Pierce is cooperating. He isn't cooperating, Charles said. He may after he sees this. Samuel looked toward the open storage unit door. Richard isn't only destroying records anymore. Annie placed her father's letter inside her jacket beside the old map. No, she said. He's choosing who he wants buried under them. At 11:45, 2 bellwether police cruisers entered Red Valley through the main gate. Richard Vale was waiting near the administration building with the local security chief and 3 members of Whitmore Capital's legal team. He wore the same dark suit he had chosen for the signing ceremony, as if the arrest of an 18-year-old worker were another item on his schedule. Charles arrived with Annie, Daniel, Samuel, and Helen several minutes later. Annie carried no toolbox this time. Her father's letter and the folded map rested inside her jacket. Richard walked forward before anyone could speak. Mr. Whitmore, I wish this had not become necessary. Charles glanced at the officers. What exactly has become necessary? Richard held up a printed report. We have evidence that Annie Brooks entered a restricted facility, introduced a chemical agent into the seed vault, and attempted to damage the control system after being dismissed. Annie looked at him. You reported that quickly. The evidence speaks for itself. Evidence usually needs time to exist before the police report is written. One of the officers, Captain Howard Briggs, stepped between them. He was broad through the shoulders, with gray hair beneath his uniform cap. Annie Brooks? Yes. We need to ask you some questions. Daniel moved beside her. I'm Daniel Price, security director for Mr. Whitmore. Before you question her, I want to see the warrant and the supporting complaint. Briggs studied him. This is a local investigation. It is also an active corporate security investigation involving interstate data transfer and attempted theft of intellectual property. Richard gave a short laugh. There it is. A simple act of sabotage turned into a conspiracy because Charles refuses to admit he trusted the wrong person. Charles's voice stayed level. Show me your evidence. Richard nodded to the local security chief, who opened a laptop on the hood of a patrol car. The first file showed Annie entering a maintenance corridor late the previous night. The recording had no sound and began after she was already inside. The second showed a bottle of chemical treatment solution inside her old locker. The third was a series of text messages sent from a number registered in Annie's name. One message read, "They'll listen when the whole place starts dying." Samuel stepped closer. That isn't how she talks. Briggs looked at him. And you are? Samuel Reed, maintenance supervisor for 31 years. Former maintenance supervisor, Richard corrected. Samuel ignored him. That locker wasn't under her control after the guards cleared the building. Richard replied, she had access for months. Annie examined the bottle in the evidence photograph. That came from Greenhouse 2. Richard folded his arms. So you recognize it. I cleaned the cart it was stored on. Half the night crew touched those bottles. Briggs closed the laptop. You can explain that at the station. Daniel held out his hand. The warrant. Briggs gave him a copy. Daniel read the first page, then checked the attached timestamp. This application was filed at 10:28. That is correct. The alleged sabotage was reported at 10:46. Briggs's expression changed. Daniel turned the document toward Charles. Someone requested the warrant 18 minutes before the official complaint existed. Richard stepped in. Administrative timestamps are often entered incorrectly. Daniel looked at him. A court clerk enters a request before your security office reports the event, and you call it clerical? Briggs took the warrant back and checked the time himself. Richard shifted his attention to Charles. You are allowing technical details to distract from the obvious. She knew the tunnels, had access to the chemicals, and had a reason to retaliate. My reason was to stop you, Annie said. You needed your job. I needed work. That doesn't mean I needed your permission to tell the truth. Briggs approached her. Until this is clarified, I'm taking you in for questioning. He reached for her wrist. Charles said, Captain, you have a defective warrant and disputed evidence. I have a judge's signature, and you have a timeline that suggests someone wrote the accusation before the event was reported. Briggs hesitated, then looked toward Richard. Was the complaint submitted earlier through another system? Richard's tone sharpened. Do not let her turn this into a debate. She was caught inside a restricted vault. With me, Charles said. Richard paused. Charles continued. She entered under my authority with my private security team. We found 2 outside technicians altering the seed samples. One is in custody. Briggs looked at Daniel. Why wasn't local law enforcement notified? Because your warrant suggests someone inside your process was already working from Vale's version of events. The captain's face hardened. Be careful. I am being careful. A younger officer moved behind Annie and took out a pair of handcuffs. Samuel stepped forward, but Annie raised one hand. Don't. The officer secured her wrists. The metal pressed against the skin where the earlier restraint from the guard had left a faint mark. Richard came close enough that only Annie and Charles could hear him. You should have stayed on the ground when they pushed you. Annie turned her head toward him. Charles heard every word. What did you say? He asked. Richard straightened. Nothing that concerns you. It concerns me now. Annie faced Charles. She did not ask him to rescue her. That made his next choice harder and more necessary. His attorneys gathered near him. One spoke quietly. Charles, let the police handle this. The signing is tomorrow. Any public conflict with local authorities could damage the transaction. Another added, if she is innocent, the process will clear her. Annie gave a tired breath. The process was ready to arrest me before the complaint was filed. Charles looked from the lawyers to the workers standing behind the fence. News of the arrest had spread, and several former employees had returned. Marlene Parker stood beside Samuel's pickup. Some held phones, others simply watched. The scene resembled the morning at the gate, Annie restrained, Richard directing events, and Charles surrounded by people explaining why silence was practical. He stepped between Annie and the patrol car. "Her name is Annie Brooks," he said. "She is not the girl, and she is not your scapegoat." Briggs lowered his voice. "Mr. Whitmore, move aside." "No, you are interfering with an arrest. I am challenging a warrant built on evidence from a man now under investigation for corporate sabotage." Richard laughed once. "Under investigation by whom? You?" Daniel's phone rang. He listened, asked 2 questions, then ended the call. "Alan Pierce has agreed to make a preliminary statement." Richard's confidence faltered. Daniel continued. "He says Vale ordered the chemical treatment, the server installation, and the attempt to place evidence in Annie's locker." "That is a lie," Richard said. "We also recovered a text from your private number telling Pierce to blame her before the police arrived." Briggs turned toward Richard. "You told me you had no contact with the contractors." "I didn't. Someone is using my number." Daniel handed the captain a printed copy of the message and the access logs. Samuel opened the box he had brought from the storage unit. He removed Marcus's maintenance report, the altered work order, and the cassette recorder. This is not the first time Vale buried a warning and blamed the worker who gave it. Briggs looked at the papers, then at the cuffs on Annie's wrists. The younger officer waited for direction. "Take them off," Briggs said. Richard stepped forward. "Captain, I said take them off." The officer released Annie. She rubbed one wrist but did not thank Charles. She looked at him and said, "You did what you should have done at the gate." Charles accepted the judgment. Richard began walking toward the administration building. Daniel called after him, "Do not leave the property." Richard stopped. "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet." "Then you have no authority to hold me." Charles spoke before Daniel could answer. "Your executive access is suspended. Your offices, devices, and vehicles are now company property under preservation order." Richard turned with a thin smile. "You are destroying your own acquisition for a temporary worker." "No," Charles said. "I may finally be finding out who tried to destroy it." Richard walked away under the watch of 2 private agents. Annie saw no defeat in his face, only calculation. Daniel's phone sounded again. He checked an alert from the seed vault monitoring system. The remote program had restarted from a second server. Temperature controls were changing, and a new countdown had begun. Richard had failed to remove Annie through the police. Now he was trying to erase everything before she could speak again. Daniel turned the tablet toward Charles. A red countdown filled the top of the screen. 6 hours until the research files were locked. 4 hours until the vault temperature rose beyond the safe range. 2 hours until the signing ceremony. Helen read the numbers once, then looked at Annie, the second server. Annie nodded. Under the old greenhouse, Richard had not needed access to the vault after all. He had built another route into the system, one that could continue the destruction even after the first device was isolated. Charles faced Daniel. "Can your team shut it down remotely?" "No. The signal is moving through an internal line. If we cut the whole network, we may lose the vault controls with it." Samuel opened Marcus's paper map on the hood of a security vehicle. "The backup line runs west from Greenhouse 1. There used to be a maintenance room below it." Helen pointed toward a faded mark. "That was converted into a storage space years ago." "On paper," Annie said. Charles looked toward the administration building. Richard stood behind an upstairs window, while 2 private agents guarded the corridor outside his office. "He knows we found the first server," Charles said. "Why activate the second while he is still here?" "Because he expects us to spend the next few hours arguing about him," Annie replied. "By the time anyone proves what happened, the seeds are gone." Daniel assigned 2 agents to remain with Richard and ordered the rest to secure the greenhouse area. Charles told his legal team to contact state police, federal investigators, and an independent digital forensics unit. No one was to rely on local records alone. Annie started toward the maintenance truck. Charles stopped her. "You have not slept. Neither has the server." "That is not an answer. It's the one we have time for." Samuel handed her a hard hat. "Being tired doesn't make you useful. It makes you quick to miss things." Annie put it on. "Then don't let me miss them." They drove across Red Valley in 2 utility vehicles. The harvested fields looked flat under the late morning sky, but the greenhouses ahead reflected enough light to hide anyone moving inside them. Helen rode beside Annie and reviewed the vault readings. Samuel sat in front with a wrench across his knees. Charles followed with Daniel in the second truck. At Greenhouse 1, the main entrance had been locked from the inside. Daniel's agent tried an electronic override. The panel rejected every code, including Charles's executive access. Vale changed the permissions, Daniel said. Annie walked along the foundation. There's another way in through the irrigation trench. Charles looked at the narrow concrete channel. How deep? Not deep. Wet. Samuel climbed down first. Mr. Whitmore, that coat cost more than my first truck. You may want to leave it here. Charles removed it and placed it in the vehicle. Annie stepped into the trench. Cold water reached above her boots. Charles followed and nearly lost his footing on the algae-covered concrete. Annie caught his forearm and steadied him. He gave her a brief nod. Thank you. She released him. Watch where the water changes color. Darker sections are deeper. They moved beneath a service platform until Samuel found a steel hatch. The bolts were rusted, but the metal around them showed fresh tool marks. Someone opened this recently, he said. Daniel's agent loosened the bolts. The hatch lifted into the greenhouse utility room. Warm air met them. Rows of empty growing tables stretched beneath glass panels. Irrigation pipes crossed the floor, and control lights blinked along one wall. Helen checked the tablet. The signal is directly below us. A storage rack covered the entrance to the lower level. It took 4 people to move it. Beneath it was a stairwell filled with ankle-deep water. Samuel stopped at the first step. That water should not be there. Annie shone her light downward. The runoff line is blocked, or opened on purpose, Daniel said. The group descended. At the bottom, the corridor split around a pressure chamber. Water covered electrical conduits along the left wall. Charles looked at Annie. Which route? She studied Marcus's map. The server room should be east. Samuel checked the pipe labels. Map says east. Flow says west. What do you mean? The cooling return is moving the wrong direction. Annie touched one of the pipes. The vibration ran toward the western corridor. They rerouted it again, she said. Charles asked, Can we still follow the map? No. We follow the system. They took the western corridor. The countdown dropped to 5 hours and 32 minutes for the data, 3 hours and 32 minutes for the vault, and 92 minutes before the ceremony. Halfway down the passage, a gas detector on Daniel's belt sounded. Stop. He checked the reading. Low oxygen ahead. Samuel pointed to a ventilation wheel near the ceiling. Manual intake. He reached for it, but his fingers could not close fully around the handle. Arthritis, he said. Bad morning for it. Annie stepped forward. Samuel shook his head. Not alone. That wheel has been closed under pressure. Charles picked up a steel bar from the floor. Show us where. Samuel placed it through the spokes. Annie and Charles pushed from opposite sides. The wheel resisted. Charles's shoes slid on the wet concrete. More leverage, Annie said. Samuel moved the bar to a lower opening. Again. This time the wheel turned. Air entered through the vent, and the detector reading began to improve. Charles caught his breath. Your father taught you that? He said strength is just leverage you haven't found yet. Samuel gave a faint smile. He stole that from me. You stole most things from each other. The detector cleared them to continue. They reached a steel door with no electronic panel. Only a mechanical lock and a keypad mounted beside it. Charles entered his executive code. The light remained red. Daniel examined the wiring. The keypad is disconnected. Helen checked the countdown. 80 minutes until the ceremony. Samuel opened a junction box beside the frame. The lock still has power. It's receiving commands from inside. Annie looked at a thin pipe running through the wall. The fire suppression release may open it. Daniel frowned. Or flood the room. It depends which way the valve is set. Samuel crouched beside the pipe. We need somebody inside the access crawl space. The opening measured less than 2 feet across. Annie removed her jacket. Charles objected. No, I'm the only one who fits. Daniel checked the space with a camera. No exposed wires. No standing water. 20 feet to the release valve. Annie looked at Samuel. Red handle? Red handle opens the door. Yellow activates suppression. Do not trust the labels. Check where the line goes. She entered the crawl space with a flashlight clipped to her hard hat. The metal pressed close around her shoulders. Behind her, Charles's voice came through the radio. Tell us what you see. 2 lines. One marked red, one yellow. Which is which? I'm checking. She followed the red line by touch. It ran upward toward the ceiling nozzles. The labels are reversed, Samuel answered. Then take the yellow. Annie reached the second valve and lifted before turning. A lock released beyond the wall. Daniel opened the steel door. The server room lights came on. 3 racks stood inside. The central screen displayed the active sabotage program, while an external transfer bar moved across the bottom. Helen read the status. The research data is being copied to Agranova. Daniel examined the ports. Can we disconnect it? Not yet, Annie said as she crawled out. If the program detects a loss of connection, it may raise the vault temperature immediately. Charles looked at the screen. Then what do we do? Annie studied the controls. We copy the proof, isolate the temperature command, and stop the transfer in that order. Samuel leaned against the wall, flexing his hands. That sounds like 3 jobs. It is. Helen moved to the data terminal. Daniel opened his forensic kit. Samuel located the mechanical cooling controls. Charles stood near the executive panel. Annie assigned each task. For the first time since Charles had arrived at Red Valley, no one waited for him to give the order. He noticed, then entered his authorization code when she asked. The screen accepted it. A list of hidden accounts appeared. One carried Richard Vale's name. Another belonged to Agranova. A third had no name, only an encrypted identification number. Daniel began copying the logs. Helen found files proving that research samples had been relabeled for transfer. Samuel reached the manual temperature switch. Annie traced the sabotage program to its command source. We can stop it, she said, but the missing control device still has a live connection. Daniel checked the signal. His expression changed. It isn't outside the property. Where is it? Charles asked. Daniel enlarged the tracking map. The signal came from the conference hall where Richard was scheduled to sign the agreement. Annie checked the countdown. 71 minutes remained. Richard had not sent the final evidence away with the escaped technician. He had kept it close enough to destroy everything during the ceremony. Daniel enlarged the signal map until the conference hall filled the screen. The tracking point remained beneath the eastern side of the stage. Someone carried the control device into the building, he said. It hasn't moved in 12 minutes. Charles checked the time. The board arrives in less than an hour. Annie looked at the hidden accounts on the server. If Richard knows we found this room, he'll trigger the program before the ceremony. He doesn't know, Daniel said. The outside connection is still active. As long as we don't shut it down, the system appears normal from his side. Helen continued copying the research records. I need 20 more minutes. Samuel kept one hand on the manual cooling switch. And I need somebody to tell me whether this gauge is lying. Annie compared the mechanical reading with the digital display. The numbers differed by less than 1 degree. For now, it's accurate. Charles turned to Daniel. How many agents can you put inside the conference hall without alerting Vale? Not enough to search it quietly. Then use the people already there. Daniel looked at him. Most of the old employees are still outside the property. Charles understood before Annie spoke. You need them, she said. He gave her a restrained look. I am aware of that. No, you're aware you need hands. That isn't the same as understanding why they might refuse. Charles stepped away from the server rack. We don't have time for another argument. Then don't argue. Tell them the truth. The room grew quiet except for the fans inside the server racks. Charles looked toward Samuel. Would they come back? Samuel did not soften his answer. For you, some won't. For Red Valley, most of them never left. Charles checked the countdown. 64 minutes remained. Daniel, keep the transfer active and protect the evidence. Helen, finish the copy. Samuel stays with the cooling controls. Annie removed her hard hat. I'm going with you. Charles started to object, then stopped himself. All right. They returned to the surface through the greenhouse. The sky had cleared, but the wind had strengthened across the harvested fields. Near the main gate, groups of former employees stood beside pickup trucks and old sedans. Some had returned for personal items. Others had heard that Annie had been arrested and came to see whether she had been taken away. Marlene Parker sat on the lowered tailgate of a Ford truck, holding a paper cup of coffee. A former forklift operator stood beside her in a faded veteran's cap. Several workers had brought spouses. No one crossed the gate. Charles walked toward them without his coat. Mud covered his shoes and the lower legs of his trousers. The sight drew attention before he said anything. Richard's local guards moved to block the entrance. Charles pointed toward the guard station. "Stand down." The security chief hesitated. "Mr. Vale instructed us." "Mr. Vale no longer gives instructions on this property." The guards stepped aside. Charles stopped several feet from the workers. No microphone, table, or lawyers stood between them. Samuel had once said working men did not call boards. Now the owner had come to the gate because those same workers controlled knowledge his board did not possess. Marlene rose. "Are we allowed to collect our things now?" "Yes," Charles said, "but that is not why I came." A man near the fence folded his arms. "Then make it quick. Some of us need to figure out how to pay for next month." Charles looked across the group. "The dismissal order is suspended effective immediately. Wages and insurance remain active, while the acquisition is reviewed." Murmurs moved through the crowd, but no one applauded. Marlene asked, "Suspended until the cameras leave?" "No." "You expect us to trust that?" "No," Charles said, "not yet." That answer quieted them more than a promise would have. He continued, "Red Valley is being sabotaged, seed research has been damaged, company data is being transferred, and evidence points to Richard Vale and outside contractors. Annie Brooks found it before I signed away control of the system." Several workers looked toward Annie. Charles said, "I removed people who understood this property and kept the people who understood how to present it on a spreadsheet. That was my decision. It was wrong." The veteran in the cap called out, "Wrong cost my wife's insurance." "I know." "No, sir, you know the sentence. She knows the cost." Charles accepted it. "Then the coverage is restored today, in writing, not after an evaluation." Marlene asked, "What do you want from us?" "The control device used to damage the vault is hidden inside the conference hall. The signing ceremony begins in less than an hour. My security team cannot search the building without alerting Vale. You know the delivery routes, storage rooms, service panels, and places strangers would use." A former cafeteria worker spoke from behind Marlene. "You want the same people you pushed out to save the company?" Annie answered before Charles could. "You can't ask people to save what you treated them like they didn't belong to." Charles looked at her, then back at the workers. "She is right. I am asking anyway, but no one who refuses will be punished." Samuel stepped through the gate. "I'm going back in." Marlene looked at him. "Because of Whitmore?" "Because Richard Vale doesn't get to burn 30 years of our work and call it efficiency." The veteran removed his cap, rubbed the brim, then put it back on. "What are we looking for?" Daniel distributed a photograph of the black control unit through a secure message to the workers' phones. Annie explained that it could be inside a service cabinet, beneath the stage, or near the projection system. The group organized itself without waiting for Charles. Packaging workers took the loading corridors. Maintenance crews covered utility rooms. Cafeteria staff entered through the kitchen. Forklift operators blocked the rear service lane. A retired electrician checked the stage power. The older receptionist who had managed visitor badges for 26 years reviewed every temporary credential issued that morning. Charles watched people he had dismissed rebuild an operation in less than 5 minutes. Annie handed him a radio. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Stay visible. Richard needs to think the signing is still happening. You're giving me the easy job. You bought it." A few workers almost smiled. Ruth Brooks arrived in an older Buick and parked near the fence. She carried a brown paper grocery bag and walked directly to Annie. "I heard you were arrested." They took the cuffs off. "That is not the same as an apology." "No, Ma." Ruth handed her the bag. Inside were peanut butter sandwiches, 2 apples, and a thermos. "You haven't eaten enough." Annie accepted it. "We're in the middle of something. People are always in the middle of something when they forget to eat." Ruth turned to Charles. Her posture remained polite, but her expression did not invite familiarity. "Mr. Whitmore." "Mrs. Brooks, a man's apology is worth exactly as much as the work he does after saying it." Charles nodded. "I understand." "No, sir. You are beginning to." She returned her attention to Annie. "Call me when this is done." The first report came over the radio. The cafeteria route was clear. Then maintenance found a recently opened panel near the stage elevators. A third worker reported an unfamiliar technician carrying a hard case beneath the conference platform. Daniel's voice followed. "Signal is moving. Annie checked the tracker. The point shifted toward the center of the hall. He knows someone is searching, she said. Charles looked toward the administration building. Guests were already arriving for the signing. Then we keep the ceremony on schedule. Annie fastened her father's badge inside her jacket and headed toward the rear entrance with Daniel. Charles called after her. Where will you be? Close to the ground, she said, where your map stops. As cameras gathered at the front doors and Richard prepared to welcome the board, Annie entered through the service corridor in the same work clothes she had worn when Red Valley threw her out. The rear corridor beneath the conference hall smelled of floor wax, electrical dust, and coffee from the catering kitchen. Annie moved beside Daniel, while voices gathered above them. Through the ceiling came the muffled rhythm of chairs shifting, microphones being tested, and reporters calling to one another. Daniel checked the tracking screen. Signal stopped again. Where? Under the center of the stage. Annie pointed ahead. There's a service crawl space behind the projection room. It runs beneath the platform. How do you know? I cleaned the air vents there last month. They reached a locked utility door. Daniel tried a master key, but the cylinder would not turn. Annie crouched near the frame and found fresh scratches around the lower hinge. He didn't use the door, she said. She removed a screwdriver from her pocket and loosened the ventilation cover beside it. Beyond the opening was a narrow space between the wall and the stage supports. Daniel aimed a light inside. Too tight for me. I can fit. You're not going alone. You can hear me on the radio. That isn't the same thing. Above them, Richard's voice came through the hall speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us at this important moment in Red Valley's history. Daniel checked the clock. We have maybe 15 minutes. Annie removed her jacket and handed it to him. Her father's badge remained clipped inside the pocket. Keep that safe. Daniel folded the jacket over one arm. If you lose radio contact, you come back. If I can. Annie. She looked at him. You come back. She nodded and entered the opening. The crawl space forced her onto her hands and knees. Dust collected on her sleeves. Wooden beams crossed above her, and electrical cables ran along the concrete below. She moved slowly, following the pulse on the tracker attached to her wrist. Richard continued speaking overhead. Red Valley. Annie paused beneath the stage. Every word carried through the floor. The agreement we signed today will give this company access to the technology, investment, and leadership needed to compete. The tracking signal strengthened. Annie followed it toward a cluster of cables beneath the projection platform. A black hard case rested between two support beams. I found it, she whispered. Daniel answered through the radio. Do not open it until I reach the access panel. There's no time. Annie, wait. She examined the case. A cable ran from it into the hall's presentation system. Another disappeared through a drilled opening toward the building network. A small green light blinked on the side. The device was active. Annie reached toward the latch, then stopped. The technicians in the vault had tied the control unit to the temperature system. Opening or removing it could trigger the final command. She followed the cables instead. One line carried data to the projection system. The other connected to a portable transmitter. A third, thinner cable ran into a maintenance relay box. Daniel, it's connected to 3 systems. Can you photograph it? She used the body camera clipped to her shirt, moving slowly around the case. Above her, applause followed Richard's introduction of Charles. Annie heard Charles approach the microphone. Thank you, Richard. His voice sounded controlled. No one in the hall would know that private security, former workers, and federal agents were already moving through the building. A faint sound came from behind Annie. A shoe scraped against concrete. She turned. The escaped technician crouched near the crawl space opening 10 feet away. He wore maintenance coveralls and held a small remote in one hand. You should have left when they fired you, he said. Annie shifted between him and the hard case. You're the one who ran from the vault, and you're the reason I'm still here. He pressed one button on the remote. The green light on the case changed to yellow. Annie's wrist tracker displayed a new countdown. 3 minutes. Daniel, she said. He activated it. The technician moved toward her. Get away from the case. What happens at 0? You don't need to know. That means you do. He reached for her arm. Annie moved aside, and his shoulder struck a support beam. The remote fell but remained within his reach. Daniel's voice came through the radio. I'm opening the east access panel. Stay where you are. The technician lunged for the remote. Annie kicked it beneath a cable tray. He grabbed her sleeve and pulled her away from the hard case. She did not try to overpower him. Instead, she reached for the loose cable running from the transmitter and wrapped it around a metal support. When he pulled again, the connector tore free from the portable antenna. The countdown continued, but the outgoing signal indicator went dark. "What did you do?" he shouted. "Stopped you from sending anything else. You didn't stop the command." The timer showed 2 minutes and 11 seconds. He shoved past her toward the case. Annie caught the back of his coveralls and held long enough for Daniel to force open the access panel. Daniel entered first, followed by another agent. "Hands up." The technician reached toward his waistband. Daniel drove him against the floor and secured both wrists before he could retrieve anything. The second agent recovered the remote. Annie returned to the hard case. 1 minute 40 seconds. Daniel checked the wiring. "Can we disconnect it? If we remove the wrong line, the vault temperature rises." "Which line is the command?" "I don't know yet." The technician laughed from the floor. "She guessed wrong in the vault once. Let her guess again." Annie ignored him. She traced the first cable to the projection system. It carried video and data but no control signal. The second had fed the transmitter. The third entered the maintenance relay box. She opened the box. Inside were 4 wires, all recently installed, each marked with the same color tape. 1 minute. Daniel leaned beside her. "Tell me what you need." "A voltmeter." The second agent handed her one from his kit. Annie tested the first wire. No signal. The second carried constant low voltage. The third pulsed every 3 seconds. "That's the command line." "Are you sure?" "No." 40 seconds. She checked the fourth wire. It carried a separate steady signal tied to the hall's lighting controls. The pulsing line matched the rhythm of the countdown. Annie cut it. The lights beneath the stage flickered. The timer stopped at 27 seconds. No one moved. Daniel checked the tracker. Vault temperature is holding. Annie released the breath she had been keeping. The hard case remained powered, but the final command had been isolated. Daniel opened it carefully. Inside was the missing control unit, storage drives, and a phone displaying a live call to Richard Vale's private number. The technician turned his face away. Daniel photographed everything before touching the phone. "This is enough," he said. Annie looked at the stage above them. "Enough to stop him? Enough to arrest him?" "That isn't what I asked." Daniel understood. The evidence could remove Richard from Red Valley, but Annie wanted the people upstairs to see what he had done. She did not want the truth reduced to a private settlement or a quiet resignation. "I want it on the screen," she said. Daniel considered the active connection to the presentation system. "We can route the files from here." "Will Richard know?" "Not until Charles gives the signal." Above them, Richard returned to the microphone. "Mr. Whitmore, the agreement is ready." Daniel spoke into his radio. "We have the device and the second technician. Evidence is intact." Charles answered quietly through the earpiece. "Stand by." An advisor entered the crawl space carrying a navy blazer. "Mr. Whitmore's team thought Miss Brooks might want this before she appears." Annie looked at the clean jacket, then at her dusty work clothes. "No." The advisor seemed uncertain. "There are cameras. That's why I'm keeping these on. These clothes may not present the right image." Annie took her jacket back from Daniel and put it on. Her father's old badge rested beside her own temporary Red Valley card. "These are the clothes I wore when they threw me out," she said. "They're the same clothes I wore when I saved what they were trying to steal." Daniel handed the evidence drive to the presentation technician he trusted. Annie followed them toward the side entrance to the stage. Through the curtain, she saw Richard smiling beside the unsigned contract. Charles stood across from him with a pen in his hand. Reporters raised cameras. Board members leaned forward. Richard placed one finger beside the signature line. Charles lowered the pen. The tip stopped less than an inch above the paper. Behind the hall, state police and federal agents moved into position. Then Charles raised his head and looked toward the stage manager. That was the signal. The main doors opened. The main doors opened before Charles's pen touched the paper. State police entered first, followed by federal agents and members of Daniel's security team. Conversations stopped. Camera shutters began clicking before anyone understood what was happening. Richard's hand remained beside the signature line. "What is this?" he asked. Charles placed the pen on the table. "The part of the agreement you hoped I would never read." 2 agents moved toward the stage. Richard stepped back. but his expression stayed controlled. There must be some misunderstanding. No, Charles said. The misunderstanding was mine. I believed you were helping me acquire Red Valley. He turned toward the screen behind the stage. The Agrinova logo disappeared. Video from Daniel's body camera filled the display. It showed the hidden seed vault beneath Greenhouse 4, the technicians in gray coveralls, the syringes inserted into storage trays, and the black device connected to the server. The room erupted in questions. Richard looked toward the projection booth. Turn that off. No one moved. Charles addressed the board. This facility was removed from the digital inventory before the acquisition. Its samples were being damaged, while Red Valley's research data was transferred to an outside server. A board member rose. Who authorized the transfer? Charles nodded toward the screen. The video changed to the command log Annie had copied from the maintenance terminal. Richard Vale's administrator account appeared beside the remote wipe order. Richard shook his head. An account name proves nothing. Anyone with system access could have copied my credentials. Daniel entered from the side of the stage with the recovered hard case. Behind him, 2 officers escorted the escaped technician into the hall. The man kept his head down. Daniel placed the case on the table but did not open it. This was recovered beneath the stage less than 10 minutes ago, he said. It contains the control unit removed from the vault, copies of Red Valley's research files, and a phone connected to Mr. Vale's private number. Richard faced Charles. Your security director is manufacturing a case because he failed to control a dismissed employee. Charles did not respond. He gave another signal. An email chain appeared on the screen. Each message connected Richard to executives and contractors working through Agrinova. The correspondence described Red Valley's research as recoverable assets and its experienced workforce as legacy exposure to be removed before transfer. A second file showed payments routed through Midwest Industrial Services. A third contained instructions to alter temperature records and relabel damaged samples after the contract was signed. Richard looked toward the representatives from Agrinova. You know nothing about this? Their lead attorney stood. Agrinova denies authorizing any illegal activity. We will cooperate with investigators. You paid the contractors. We will address that through counsel. Richard's restraint began to break. He pointed at Charles. You are destroying this transaction based on claims from an 18-year-old laborer who was fired yesterday. The side curtain opened. Annie stepped onto the stage in her work clothes. Dust still marked her sleeves. Her father's old Red Valley badge rested beside her temporary employee card. Some reporters turned their cameras toward her. Others began asking her name. Richard laughed, but the sound carried no confidence. This is your source? He asked Charles. A child who cleaned irrigation trenches for 4 months? Annie stopped near the edge of the table. I cleaned the places your executives never entered, she said. That's why I saw what they missed. You saw what you wanted to see after losing your job. I reported the pressure changes before I was fired. According to whom? According to the supervisor, you moved to another shift. Richard glanced toward the rear of the hall. Samuel stood near the doors with Helen and several former employees. Annie continued. You changed the ventilation lines. You removed the seed vault from the digital map. You hired technicians through a company that exists only as a mailing address. Then you planted chemicals in my locker before the police complaint was filed. Richard looked at the reporters. She is using race and poverty to turn a routine dismissal into a spectacle. Annie did not raise her voice. You made it about race when you decided no one would question evidence placed against a black worker. You made it about poverty when you assumed I would lie for a paycheck. You made it about power when you believed pushing me outside meant I could never come back with proof. A reporter called out, Mr. Vale, did you authorize the warrant request before the sabotage was reported? Richard ignored the question. Another asked, did you know the seed vault existed? Richard looked toward Charles. You cannot be serious about trusting her with a company of this size. Charles stepped away from the signing table. I did not believe Annie because of her age, her position, or the clothes she wore, he said. I believed her because she showed me evidence while the people with titles kept asking me not to look. Richard's face tightened. Charles turned toward the board. The contract before us is not a technology partnership. It is a transfer of control designed to leave Whitmore Capital responsible for a failure that was created in advance. He opened the agreement to a marked page. This clause gives Agrinova emergency access to Red Valley's research systems immediately after signature. Another makes Red Valley responsible for all biological losses discovered after transfer. Mr. Vale expected me to sign the death certificate before anyone found the body. Several board members began speaking at once. One demanded the meeting be suspended. Another asked whether stock regulators had been notified. Daniel answered, "Federal investigators and state authorities have received preserved copies of the evidence." Richard moved away from the table. An agent stepped into his path. "Mr. Vale, remain where you are. Am I under arrest?" The lead federal agent approached the stage. "Richard Vale, you are being detained in connection with corporate sabotage, theft of trade secrets, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Richard turned toward the Agranova delegation. No one met his eyes. The agent reached for his wrist. Richard pulled away and rushed toward the side exit. Daniel blocked him before he reached the curtain. Richard tried to push past, but two agents secured his arms and placed him in handcuffs. The hall filled with camera flashes. As Richard was brought across the stage, he stopped beside Annie. His face no longer carried the practiced patience he had shown Charles for months. "You think this makes you important?" he said quietly. Annie looked at the cuffs, then at the unsigned contract. "No. It proves you were wrong about who would be heard." Richard was led toward the main doors. The workers separated to let him pass. None applauded. Samuel removed his cap and held it against his chest, not out of respect for Richard, but because the moment carried the weight of years spent waiting for someone to believe what had happened inside Red Valley. Charles returned to the table and lifted the contract. For 1 second, Richard looked back. Charles tore the signature page in half. The sound was small, but every microphone in the room caught it. Annie watched the pieces fall onto the table. The agreement had been stopped, the vault remained stable, and Richard was leaving in handcuffs. Yet beyond the hall, hundreds of workers still did not know whether they would have insurance, wages, or a place at Red Valley by the end of the week. She turned to Charles. "This isn't finished." He followed her attention toward the employees standing near the doors. "No," he said, "it isn't." Richard had been exposed under the lights, but justice would be measured by what happened after the cameras turned away. The federal agents led Richard out through the main doors while the hall remained filled with reporters, board members, and former employees who had not yet been told whether they still had jobs. Charles stepped away from the torn contract and spoke quietly to Daniel. "Keep every device, office, and vehicle under preservation order. No files leave this property." Daniel nodded. "State investigators are sealing Vale's office now. Agranova's representatives have been told not to depart until their identities are recorded." Charles looked toward the workers gathered near the rear of the hall. Many still held the boxes they had carried from their lockers. Marlene Parker stood with her purse tucked beneath one arm. Samuel remained beside Helen, his cap in his hands. Annie had moved away from the cameras. She stood near the side wall, watching the people Richard had ordered removed only hours earlier. Charles approached her. "The board wants an emergency meeting. They can wait." He glanced toward the directors gathering around the conference table. "They are responsible for the company. So are the people who kept it running while the board believed Richard's reports." Charles understood what she expected. He returned to the stage and adjusted the microphone. "Before any board meeting begins, the employees of Red Valley need an answer." The room quieted again. Charles asked the security staff to open the remaining doors. Workers who had waited outside were allowed into the hall. Some entered cautiously. Others remained near the threshold, unwilling to trust another announcement. Charles waited until they had settled. "This morning, I approved the termination of Red Valley's existing workforce," he began. "I made that decision before speaking with the people who understood this property. I relied on reports prepared by a manager who was working against the company. But the reports are not an excuse. The decision carried my authority." A reporter raised a hand, but Charles continued. "I also allowed security to remove employees in a way no person should be treated. I did not order anyone pushed or humiliated. I stood there and failed to stop it. That failure is mine." No applause followed. Marlene called from the front row. "What happens to our insurance?" "Coverage is restored immediately and will remain active during the investigation." "What about wages?" another worker asked. "Everyone dismissed this morning will be paid for the full week. No employee will lose scheduled income because of my decision." A man near the aisle folded his arms. "And next week? The mass termination order is canceled." The room shifted with low conversation. Charles raised one hand. "That does not mean nothing will change." Red Valley still needs repair, new investment, and better technology. But those changes will not be planned without representatives from the workforce. No position will be removed by spreadsheet alone. Samuel spoke from the side. Who decides which workers represent us? You do. Several board members exchanged uneasy looks. Charles faced them. A transition council will be formed with elected employee representatives, maintenance, scientific staff, safety specialists, and independent legal oversight. The board will not choose the labor representatives. One director rose. Charles, commitments of this scale require a vote. The insurance and wage restoration fall under emergency operating authority. You may vote on the permanent structure after the employees select their representatives. The director began to object, but Helen stood. You were prepared to vote on a transfer agreement built on false data, she said. You can spend one afternoon listening to the people who discovered it. The director sat down. Charles continued. Every workplace incident reviewed under Richard Vale's authority will be reopened. That includes the death of Marcus Brooks. Annie's hand tightened around the folded letter inside her jacket. Charles motioned to Daniel, who passed him a preliminary report prepared by investigators. The original findings stated that Marcus entered a restricted chemical area without authorization. The maintenance logs, dispatch record, and recorded conversation recovered today show he was ordered to respond after warning management that the installed valve was unsafe. Ruth Brooks had entered the hall without Annie noticing. She stood near the doors, holding her handbag with both hands. Charles read the next line carefully. Until the formal investigation is complete, Red Valley withdraws the claim that Marcus Brooks caused the accident through misconduct. His personnel record will be corrected, and his family will receive all compensation withheld under that finding. Ruth closed her eyes for a moment. Annie walked to her. Ruth took Annie's hand and said in a low voice, "Your father can rest with his name back." Annie could not answer immediately. She leaned close enough for Ruth's shoulder to steady her, then turned back toward the stage. Charles had waited. When Annie faced him, he said, "There is one more matter." A Whitmore Capital advisor approached with a prepared statement. Charles glanced at it, then set it aside. Red Valley nearly lost its seed research, operating data, and financial future because its leadership ignored the people closest to the work. Annie Brooks prevented that loss. Cameras turned toward her. Annie remained beside Ruth. Charles continued, "I intend to appoint Annie as acting executive director of Red Valley's operations and worker safety transition." The announcement produced immediate reactions. Reporters spoke over one another. Several directors protested. Workers turned toward Annie with surprise. Charles raised his voice only enough to be heard. "This is not an appointment as chief executive of Whitmore Capital. Annie will oversee Red Valley's operational review, safety transition, infrastructure mapping, and employee representation. She will work with an advisory group that includes Dr. Helen Ward, Samuel Reed, elected workers, independent engineers, and legal counsel." One board member spoke into the microphone. "She is 18 years old and has no management degree." Annie stepped toward the stage. Charles did not answer for her. She took the microphone. "That is true," she said. "I'm 18. I haven't finished my education, and I don't know how to run every department here." The room quieted, but neither did Richard Vale. He knew how to control the information that reached people above him. "That is not the same as knowing how the company works." The board member asked, "Why should the employees accept your authority?" "They shouldn't accept it just because Mr. Whitmore announced it. They should have the right to question me, correct me, and remove their representatives if those people stop speaking for them." Annie turned toward Charles. "Are you offering this because I saved your investment, or because you're finally ready to hear the people who work here?" "Both," Charles said. "But if I stop listening, I expect you to remind me which one matters more. I have conditions." A few reporters leaned closer. "Safety reports must go to an independent office, not through finance. Workers who report problems must be protected from retaliation. No experienced employee is replaced by automation without a review that includes the people doing the work. My education cannot be used as payment for silence, and my face cannot be used in advertising while the old system remains unchanged." Charles nodded. "Agreed. I'm not finished." A brief smile crossed Samuel's face. "Marcus's case must be investigated outside the company. The families affected by hidden safety failures must receive the results. Employees must elect members to the Transition Council, and any permanent appointment for me has to be reviewed after I complete training and prove I can do the work. Charles looked toward the board. Those conditions will be entered into the formal resolution. Annie handed the microphone back. She had not accepted a gift. She had defined the terms under which she would serve. Later, after the reporters climb prawn to a separate briefing room, pie per Juarez's caples. Per brought from the kitchen, workers gathered around long cafeteria tables. Coffee, chicken sandwiches, bowls of soup. People who had been forced out that morning sat beside security agents, scientists, and managers. No one pretended trust had been restored in a single day. Marlene asked for the insurance promise in writing. Samuel demanded an independent inspection of every pressure line. Helen requested armed security for the seed vault until federal investigators completed their work. Charles approved each request. As evening approached, he found Annie near the main gate. The tools scattered there that morning had been placed inside her metal box. He handed it to her. "I owe you more than an appointment. You owe a lot of people more than that." "I know." Annie took the box. Beyond the fence, the fields had gone dark. The buildings behind them remained active as investigators, maintenance workers, and scientists began the work Richard had tried to stop. Charles asked, "Will you take the position?" Annie looked back at Red Valley. "I'll take it for the transition." "That sounds temporary." "It is. Authority should have to prove itself too." Charles nodded. For the first time that day, Annie passed through the gate without anyone trying to stop her. But she knew a reopened gate was only a beginning. The harder work would be making sure it never closed the same way again. By early April, the ground around Red Valley had softened enough to hold fresh tire tracks. Snowmelt had drained from the service roads, and the first green shoots appeared along the edges of the fields. The old company had not returned. Too much had changed for that. The seed vault now operated under independent monitoring. Safety reports went to an office outside the financial chain of command. Every major repair required signatures from engineering, maintenance, and an elected worker representative. The digital property map had been rebuilt using records from Helen, Samuel, and crews who had spent decades moving through the site. Marcus Brooks's hand-drawn map hung in a glass case inside the new training center. The paper remained creased, with faded pencil lines crossing beneath Greenhouse 4. A small plaque beside it read, "Marcus Brooks, Safety and Trades Center. Knowledge carries responsibility." Annie had refused a larger dedication. "My father wouldn't want his name on a building if people still had to enter unsafe rooms alone," she had told Charles. The rule was written into the new safety policy. No employee could be ordered into a hazardous area without a second trained worker. Active monitoring, and the right to stop the job without punishment. Annie divided her time between Red Valley and evening classes at a community college outside Des Moines. She had completed her high school equivalency exam in February and begun courses in agricultural systems and industrial safety. Her office was a converted conference room near the maintenance floor, not the executive suite Richard had used. The door usually remained open. A whiteboard covered one wall with repair schedules, training dates, and questions no one had answered yet. She had learned quickly that finding a hidden vault was simpler than managing people who disagreed over budgets, overtime, and equipment. Some days, workers expected her to support every request because she had once stood outside the gate with them. Some executives expected her to approve every delay because she now carried a management title. She did neither. When she did not know something, she asked. When she made a wrong decision, she corrected it before someone else had to carry the cost. That morning, she stood beside an irrigation control station with Samuel and 3 engineers. One engineer, a man twice her age, explained why replacing the entire pressure assembly would save time. Samuel disagreed. "The housing is sound. We need the seals and the upper valve." The engineer turned to Annie. "A complete replacement gives us a cleaner system. It also costs $80,000 more," she said. "It reduces uncertainty." Samuel tapped the housing with one knuckle. "Uncertainty isn't the same as failure." Annie examined the inspection records, then asked the youngest technician in the group, a woman named Carla, what she had found during the pressure test. Carla hesitated. The housing passed. The loss came from the upper seal. The senior engineer looked at her. "That test was preliminary." "Was it wrong?" Annie asked. "No. Then we replace what failed and monitor the rest for 90 days. Samuel nodded. The engineer started to object. but Annie added, "Put your concerns in the report. If the next test supports full replacement, we'll do it." The decision satisfied no one completely, which Annie was learning often meant it was worth examining. A black pickup stopped near the control station. Charles stepped out wearing work boots and a canvas jacket. Mud covered one side of the truck. Samuel looked at the boots. "Those finally see dirt?" Charles checked the soles. Apparently more than the salesman expected. He had begun visiting Red Valley twice a month without bringing the full Whitmore Capital staff. He attended maintenance meetings, asked questions, and wrote down answers. He still moved quickly and disliked delays, but he no longer treated hesitation as weakness when it came from someone protecting the work. He waited until the engineers left before speaking to Annie. The board approved the permanent transition structure. With the worker seats, 4 elected seats, 2 scientific, 2 operations, 1 safety, and 3 financial. Independent reporting? Preserved. And the whistleblower policy? Outside counsel receives the complaints. Annie nodded. "Then it's useful." Charles gave her a folded document. "Your performance review." She opened it. The board had extended her appointment for 2 years, with authority over Operen. "You added the sentence about removing me," she said. "You requested it." The document allowed the transition council to recommend her removal through a recorded vote. "Authority should have to prove itself," Charles said. Annie looked up. "You remembered. I have people remind me." Near the training center, folding tables had been arranged for the spring safety luncheon. Ruth had brought 2 peach cobblers in covered glass dishes. Marlene Parker managed the coffee urn while arguing with a board representative about prescription coverage. Children of employees followed Helen through a greenhouse tour, each carrying a paper cup filled with soil and 1 seed. Ruth approached Annie with a plate. "You missed breakfast." "I had coffee." "That is not breakfast." Charles accepted a slice of cobbler before Ruth could offer it. She looked at him. "You've learned one thing. Never refuse food when you are present. That may be the most useful." At the front of the training center, Samuel spoke to a group of younger workers about the flood season of 1993, when crews had used tractors to move pumps through waist-deep water. He did not tell the story to prove the past was better. He told it to explain why emergency plans needed people who knew how a place behaved when ordinary systems failed. Annie watched one of the younger workers study Marcus's map. "Was your father an engineer?" he asked. "No." "He drew all this?" "He maintained it." The worker considered that. "Looks like engineering. Sometimes the title comes after the knowledge," Annie said. "Sometimes it never comes." In the afternoon, she walked with Charles toward the main gate. A second guide map had been installed beside the employee entrance, showing emergency routes, safe gathering points, and the older service tunnels in clear lines. The gate itself had been repainted, but Annie could still identify the section of pavement where her toolbox had opened months earlier. Charles stopped there. "What do we fix next?" he asked. Annie looked across the fields. Tractors moved along the first prepared rows. Red Valley's new planting season had begun with fewer speeches and more inspections. "We stop waiting for things to break." Charles smiled. "That sounds expensive." "Not as expensive as pretending nothing is wrong." They continued toward the entrance. The guard on duty opened the gate. "Good evening, Miss Brooks." "Good evening, Mr. Harris." Her old temporary badge remained clipped inside her jacket beside the worn employee card that had belonged to Marcus. The new card rested above them. "Annie Brooks, Executive Operations Director." Charles slowed and allowed her to pass first. Months earlier, Red Valley had nearly lost its future because its leaders refused to listen to the youngest worker at the gate. Annie had not saved it because she held the highest title or had the strongest voice. She saved it because she understood what powerful people had forgotten. Those closest to the ground are often the first to feel the earth begin to move. The story reminds us that truth can come from the person society is quickest to dismiss. Annie saves Red Valley not because she has wealth, status, or an impressive title, but because she has knowledge, courage, and the strength to speak when silence would be easier. Real justice is more than punishing the guilty. It also means restoring dignity to the people who were ignored, protecting workers from abuse, and changing the system so the same injustice cannot happen again. True leadership begins when those in power stop looking down on others and start listening to the people closest to the work. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.